I'm Garrett Ryan. I run Trojan Stone, a YouTube channel about Roman and Greek history. I come out of academia. I have a PhD in Greek and Roman history. The Greeks absolutely stand at the absolute origins of Western civilization, and so much of what we do today comes from this brief, brilliant period in the classical world. About 4 times a month, every citizen in Athens will meet in this place called the Pnyx, this hill near the Acropolis, and debate the issues of the day. Politics really is in the hands of the people. Greek science often combines theoretical brilliance with a complete indifference to experiment. And so they come up with these brilliant ideas like Democritus, the idea of the atom. By the 4th century BC, Rome is the most important power in central Italy. They're also, almost uniquely, driven by war. After they took Egypt, they would carve up to 60-ton columns from granite, haul them across this burning waste, the desert, to the Nile, up the Nile, across the Mediterranean to Rome. What they build on the ruins of the world that they seize is the most long-lasting and stable civilization the world had ever known. This system that had such immense staying power for half a millennium, that held together the whole Mediterranean world, suddenly came unstitched. I'm Garrett Ryan. I run Trojan Stone, a YouTube channel about Roman and Greek history. I come out of academia. I have a PhD in Greek and Roman history and taught for a couple of years before leaving to start Trojan Stone.
We're not going to hold that against you, though.
No, actually, it's been wonderfully liberating, to be honest. I way prefer it.
Yeah, good.
And so I cover a wide range of topics: daily life in the ancient world, impressive buildings, the great characters, the Alexanders, the Cleopatras, pretty much everything I can think about that's interesting and people want to know more about. And I'm looking forward to explaining more about the ancient world today.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to learn about it. The ancient Greeks and the Romans have always been fascinating to me. More so the Greeks, I think, than the Romans. I feel like we're kind of still in ancient Rome today.
I think there's a real sense in which, Rome is sort of this modern counterpart to America,
yeah,
which we can talk about a little bit later, actually. But
sure.
The Greeks absolutely stand at the absolute origins of Western civilization.
Right.
And so much of what we do today comes, from this brief, brilliant period in the classical world.
They were incredible, weren't they, the Greeks? I mean, if you could look at the ancient architecture and the structures that the Greeks built and see them in their full glory today, I mean, what would that be like? What would that surpass a lot of they're much more impressive, I think, than we give them credit for from an architectural standpoint.
Absolutely. They have in Nashville this replica of the Parthenon, which is not a great replica, honestly. That they try to fudge some of the details. They didn't put all of the sculpture on it. But it's a big, impressive building. What's really cool about it, though, is the sheer amount of sculpture and the quality of it. This incredibly lifelike sculpture, all painted. It would seem, I think, a little bit garish to us, in these very bright, almost jarring colors. But in the Greek sunshine, all that marble, is already brilliantly shining. All these colors be glistening against that blue backdrop. It would have been, I think, almost visually overwhelming. The Parthenon, the whole Acropolis. It is. And it stands, as I mentioned before, at the origins of all of our own idea of architecture, actually, in a lot of ways. Look everywhere you see the columns, the pediments, the moldings. It's almost pervasive.
Yeah, what was life really like back then for ancient Greeks? Like daily life. What were it was a long span of a civilization, right? So when did they begin?
What we think of as Greek civilization begins in the Archaic era, around 800 BC, give or take, and it goes through Alexander, who conquers the known world or most of it, and then we have the Hellenistic period afterward, in which the Greek civilization goes global, so to speak. So those really 5 centuries, let's say 800 to 300 BC, are what we call the apogee of ancient Greece, and especially the classical period, which is from the Persian Wars, which ended in 480 BC through Alexander, 323 is when he dies. And so in that period, we really focus on one city, which is Athens, the biggest and richest city in the immediate Greek world anyway, because it produces so much brilliant thought. We have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are in this one city in this brilliant period. We have these great sculptors, your Praxiteles, your Phidias. So much of what we think of as Western Civ comes from this one place in time, this relatively small, maybe 50,000 people city in about 100 years. From just Athens in the classical world.
What millennia or what century?
This is in the 5th and 4th centuries BC.
Okay. Yeah, and that was kind of the peak. And so what are they doing in Athens? Like, what is life like at that point? What's like? It's a full economy. I mean, you've got what are people? You wake up in the morning. What's life like?
Right. So Athens is a rich city for a couple of reasons. It has a little empire of its own. The whole Aegean Sea, pretty much, in the 5th century especially, is an Athenian lake. They have these silver mines in Laurion in the south tip of Attica, where they pump lots of money into the economy. And so between these silver mines, this miniature empire, and the commerce of Athenian ships going all over the Mediterranean world, a lot of people have quite a bit of money and a fair amount of leisure to do things like politics. Athens famously is the first true democracy in the world. And so, of course, it depends who you are. Quite a few, probably a third of the population is enslaved. And, of course, you're working. If you're a slave, you could be a house slave. You could be working in those silver mines, which is a pretty awful fate.
Where do the slaves come from?
Mostly from what's now Ukraine, along the Black Sea. A lot of them come and from Thrace, Bulgaria, pretty much. They come down from the north.
Just taken? Just would the Greek army just go and take people and bring them back, or how did it work?
There are slave traders up there.
Okay.
So other tribes are fighting each other. The people who lose the wars are sold as slaves.
Okay.
And there are Greek middlemen then who sell them on towards Athens, where the money is.
Okay.
And so, of course, how your days play out depends on your status. But if you're not a slave, let's say you're a moderately prosperous Greek dude, you get up early. That's always how it works in the classical world. You're up with the sun for the most part.
Okay.
And you don't wear very much in the summer, especially bare feet quite often, very simple sandals, just a simple knee-length tunic for the most part. If you run a shop, you might go down towards the agora, the main marketplace. If you're a blacksmith, or you sell cheese or something, and you'll run, usually they're very small shops. There are very few large industries in the Greek as opposed to the Roman world. We hear about one guy who has a shield factory, which has a couple hundred slaves, but that's about as big as commerce gets in this period. So you might run your shop, have maybe a few slaves work with you, a few apprentices. But you will have quite a bit of time typically, or make quite a bit of time for politics, because in the 4th century especially, they pay people to go attend assembly meetings. About 4 times a month, every citizen in Athens, about, let's say 20,000 people at an upper end, will meet in this place called the Pnyx, this hill near the Acropolis, and debate the issues of the day. They'll vote on measures, on laws, for example, on whether to go to war or, have a peace treaty. Politics really is in the hands of the people. And that's almost unique in the ancient world. Most Greek cities have some kind of assembly, but in Athens, they really do call the shots. Every office is held for only a single year. There's no real oligarchy there. There are aristocrats, people like Pericles, who was this famous figure from Athens' oldest families, who becomes this kind of like de facto president almost of the democracy for quite a bit of time. But it really is a kind of volatile politics in some way. They change from day to day. And the Romans especially look at all this with a great deal of suspicion. This is a little too democratic for their tastes.
And when were the Romans kind of coming up, and what was that, like 400?
Yeah, it's later.
Okay.
So the Romans at this time, so like in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, are a small local power in central Italy.
Right.
They have a good-sized city-state, but no more than that. Their expansion really comes in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And they take Athens in the later 2nd century BC, and all of Greece becomes a Roman province at that point.
Okay. So back to the Greeks then, and they're also talking about like philosophy and, what is their basic view on reality? They're the myths. Do they feel like the Greek myths are real? Do they feel like the Greek myths are just myths to help them, learn how to live and to guide their decisions? Or what was kind of like the religion and the beliefs of the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it seems like from a pretty early period, even from like the 6th century BC, quite a few people, in the upper classes at least, the ones who are writing things that we can read and understand, do regard the myths as just stories, as ways of understanding the world, as almost allegories in some ways for how the gods do work. There are a few people who deny that there are gods. That seems self-evident to them. The question is how much the gods interact with mankind, how much they care. And they respect Homer, Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and his vision of the gods as this literary universe that they sympathize with. It's very appealing to them because they understand it. It's part of their education. But they don't take it all that seriously. They think that Zeus is not the kind of capricious, almost childlike creature you have in the Odyssey, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. He's probably something more serious, this almost cosmic force that drives the weather. Everyday people, we don't know what they thought. They might have taken the myths more seriously because it was a way to know the gods. The gods are very human, which is both good and bad, of course. But it seems like philosophers, at least, tend to regard the myths as, perhaps they can be, as I said, allegorized. They can be seen as a key to the gods, but they are not literally true, at least in the classical period. The philosophers before Socrates, who really begins what we think of as philosophy, an ethically focused philosophy, are really natural philosophers. People like Thales and Anaximander, we call them the pre-Socratics. They want to know how the world works. And they have all these crazy theories, so like the world is all water, the world is all fire. There's some primal element that's been transmuted into the world that we see. And for these guys, the gods, again, are there, they're present, but they're part of this, physical universe and almost kind of just driving its forces. Anaxagoras is in Athens at the time of Pericles, and he's actually persecuted for impiety, but it's more of a political attack on Pericles, we think. That's the other thing, that there's no real theology in Greek religion. Unlike Christianity or Islam, where there's a scripture and a clear sense that this is right and wrong, this is what God wants you to do and act, how you think and act. It's very much what you do that defines your ties to the gods, and that above all means sacrifice. So that by sacrificing a goat or a cow to Zeus, you are honoring that god and confirming the ties between that god and your city and yourself. It's not about what you believe, it's about what you enact, what you physically do for the gods. The gods aren't mind readers. They don't really care what if you're a good or a bad person so much. It's that you're honoring them, honoring their strength and their power.
Okay. So in terms of like the peak of their knowledge or the biggest discoveries that they had, what did they know? What were they able to really figure out that's kind of like mind-blowing for us as we look back upon them today?
Greek science often combines theoretical brilliance with a complete indifference to experiment. So they don't really, test their theories. They don't have the machines, the scientific method that we do. And so they come up with these brilliant ideas, like Democritus, the idea of the atom, for example, this unsplittable, that's what atom means, unsplittable, particle that underlies all things. He can't see, he doesn't have an electron microscope or anything, but he assumes that there can be this underlying substrate of reality of which all things are composed. Brilliant, but he can't prove it or really discuss how it works.
Sure.
They have, they understand the world is round, for example, and also that a lot of them think the world does revolve around the sun. That's the idea of the Earth at the center of the solar system becomes a little bit later, or it's one of several competing theories. I think the most impressive Greek scientist in some ways is Aristotle, who really pioneers biology. And, he does dissections of creatures, for example, describes how their organs work, is fascinated by just every aspect of the ancient world, the natural world. He even looks into weather and earthquakes. Again, they don't understand plate tectonics, they don't have, weather balloons or anything, but they can observe and kind of extrapolate from that. And so you have a very impressive body of observation and some brilliant theories, but they aren't really tied together in the way we would, with our scientific method and our kind of double-blind studies, et cetera.
But then, what about their knowledge of like the solar system and the cosmos? I mean, you mentioned that they knew that the Earth orbited the sun. So, I guess like what else did they know, and when was that knowledge kind of lost? I mean, the Romans obviously the Christianity and Romans thought that the Earth was in the center for, and it was you would have been killed if you disagreed with that. So
later on, like Galileo. What happens is there's several competing models of how the solar system works, and one of these, a guy named Ptolemy, who's a Roman era living in Alexandria, an astronomer, a scientist, his model of the solar system, which does rely on very closely observed observations. Because you really can make an Earth-centered solar system work if you fudge the numbers just the right way.
Yeah, sure.
The orbits work in just this way.
It's like the unemployment numbers.
Right. Yeah. There are, there's cycles, there are epicycles, and so he has that wizardry. It's like, okay, I have this idea, I'm going to fudge it until it works.
Yeah.
And he his math is
You
so
can make
good.
anything fit into your
Exactly.
system.
Yeah,
Yes,
data is
absolutely.
infinitely flexible,
Right.
and he knew that,
Right.
Ptolemy.
Yep.
And so his system works so well, is so internally consistent, that it became the default one. It kind of outcompeted all the others and became the default system through Copernicus, basically. That's really what happened. It wasn't like it was imposed. It just seemed like it made the most sense.
So I guess I'm visualizing now a civilization that has competing theories, that has, maybe they haven't all come together on one thing as it relates to the nature of, the cosmos, for example. But then, and I hear you on that, but then we have this Antikythera device,
Yes.
right? That pops up and supposedly that thing can predict eclipses and the moon position and the position of the planets and all this stuff. So how does that rationalize into what you're saying?
Yeah, so the Antikythera mechanism, it's found.
Damn, you're quick, Ryan.
Yeah, that's great. It's found more about 100 years ago. It's probably made in about the 1st century BC on the island of Rhodes, we think.
Okay.
And it's called, the first analog computer in some ways, because it is this incredibly ornate system of gears that allow to predict a whole series of astronomical phenomena. It's kind of a one-off. We don't have anything like it anywhere else. It's probably just one workshop somewhere in Rhodes of some master craftsman and his apprentices are making these things, and they're useful in the sense you can't predict certain solar phenomenon, but it's really kind of a toy, and it shows the depth of their observations. That they knew when these things happen, on a certain pattern. They had very detailed records, borrowed from the Babylonians in some cases and the Egyptians, who had much older series of astronomical records than they did. And they also had the mechanical capacity to make these elaborate, toothing gears that turn this thing around. So as I said, the Ptolemaic universe does fit an observed model. You can make observations fit this pretty well. It's just that some things don't quite work, and that's what Copernicus and Galileo, eventually realized and could see with their telescopes. They didn't have the lenses quite as good as the guys did in the 16th century.
Okay, so it was made near the end of so it's like a first century BC kind of a.
We think so, yeah.
We think so, right? Yeah, I guess impossible to know, right? But that. It's just fascinating from just what they were able to what they knew about how the solar system and the planets kind of move around, and to be able to predict that on a gear based metal device just out of nowhere is like it's mind blowing.
It's one of these things where you wonder what would have happened if it wasn't just one guy, who was doing this. If it had become more widespread, this kind of technology, they knew they had steam power. That they had these steam-powered toys, basically. They could open temple doors with a touch with the steam-powered devices. But they never became more than a toy. They had the technology. They could have done things like, Newcomen steam engines, or even locomotives. Given a pretty modest jump. But they never made that leap for various social reasons, we think.
Okay, so like individuals, and that's kind of like I asked you about the Baalbek stone last night, and we'll maybe get to that a little bit later. But that sounds like kind of like from your perspective a one-off, and I want to dive into that a little bit later. But
sure.
Okay, so interesting. So then the most fascinating accomplishments from a scientific standpoint would be, we're talking about the cosmos, we're talking about theories about various things like the atom and whatnot. Anything else there before we kind of shift to the next, like what in any other just mind-blowing kind of accomplishments that they had?
People talk about, Archimedes, for example, the great Syracusan inventor, who is a brilliant mathematician, but also a great inventor. When the Romans take Syracuse during the Second Punic War, the war with Hannibal, he devises all of these crazy machines that, drive them off, really showing how this science was abstract in many ways. Mathematics, just a Greek meant algebra, trigonometry. But it could be applied in all kinds of interesting ways. But it wasn't applied very often. I mentioned before how we have all these kind of one-offs where things could have been taken in all kinds of different directions given a different political and social climate, but just weren't. So then Archimedes is one of these other fascinating characters who, if lived in a different century, would have had a very different kind of career, probably.
Yeah, it just shows that the knowledge was there, the Antikythera device, you
Yeah.
know? I mean, even if it's a one-off, even if it's a small group of people that built it, and I don't know, would metal, if it was the entire civilization that was creating these little devices and everybody had the knowledge, I mean, the knowledge would fade, of course, because, you're talking 300 years later, Earth is back at the center of the universe, the metal's going to corrode. Would we even know, if it was more widespread than a one-off? I know we think it's a one-off because we've only found one randomly, but
Right. I guess I shouldn't say one-off. It probably was maybe there were a few hundred of these things, but it probably just one workshop, we assume, or one set of workshops. This is, again, one theory. We're not sure because it is bronze, and metal corrodes. Metal, or iron especially, really corrodes badly in seawater. So it is quite possible there were many more, but probably not. It's never described anywhere in our texts. Not that it necessarily would be. Often our classical authors are fascinated by a few things. If you're an ancient historian, it's about high politics, right? What the emperor is doing, what the senators are doing. No one cares about the workmen. No one cares about what's happening below the level of the aristocracy. And so there might have been all kinds of other innovations. There's a great story, and it probably is just a story, about a guy in the reign of Vespasian, the Roman emperor who reigned in the late 1st century AD. Who devised unbreakable glass. It was glass that could be molded into any shape. And he shows the emperor, and the emperor then orders him to never make it again because it put glassblowers out of business. So it's probably not true, but it does show this kind of idea, this mindset that's not really bent toward advances in technology. It's about the status quo, about keeping workers employed, about keeping those in power.
Yeah, we see that today as
we
well.
Do, yeah,
for sure. So, okay, so then, I mean, in terms of like the Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and those guys, like, what's kind of the story there? Where are they? Who's the first one? What are they?
Sure, yeah.
What are they doing? And yeah, what's the situation?
Yeah, well, it's a big story. In many ways, the biggest story in Western intellectual, achievement. So Socrates is a guy who wanders the agora in Athens barefoot, asking awkward questions, basically. What is the nature of truth? What is the nature of piety? And he pretty much annoys Athens for decades, but he attracts this whole school of often wealthy young men who want to learn more, are really intrigued by what the questions he's asking, because he's the first, truly ethical philosopher who's trying to get at the roots of why we do what we do, and what the right virtues are to guide our lives. And his most important pupil is Plato, who's a generation younger than he is. And after Socrates is executed by Athens at the age of 70 for corrupting the youth, for introducing strange new ideas, it's probably more of a political thing, we think, that he was linked with these guys who had seized power in Athens briefly. Some of his young pupils were among this junta that had overthrown the democracy. And so he's kind of caught up in the backlash of that. But anyway, Plato never really forgives the democracy for this.
How did they kill him?
It made him drink hemlock, this poison that paralyzes your body and causes you to pretty much suffocate.
Okay.
And you can still see it in the Agora, supposedly the prison in which he was executed. We don't know if it's the place, but quite possibly. And so anyway, he wrote nothing that we have anyway. But Plato, his brilliant student, wrote a series of dialogues in which he is the main character, and in which he does what he did, at least initially. He asks questions to people in the Agora or at symposia, these dinner parties, asking them, for example, what is piety? Why do we honor the gods? And why do the gods love what is good? And so Plato's dialogues get more and more complex with time. They begin with kind of talking about what certain virtues are in this sort of question and answer format. And they begin evolving what we call the theory of forms, the idea that everything that is in our world is a pale reflection of this perfect version of itself in some other realm. So that there is an ideal of truth, for example, and then our truth partakes of that in some way. And it's a way of trying to identify the nature of being, basically. Plato eventually gets beyond the idea of the theory of forms. He kind of decides it's probably not correct, but it's one of the most lasting legacies anywhere in Western thought, thinking about how we think about epistemology, about ontology. Plato's great pupil is Aristotle, and he's much more this worldly, much more focused on, like I mentioned before, biology, and kind of understanding the world around us and creating systematized treatises that explain things like rhetoric, things like ethics. So they're all part of the same lineage intellectually, kind of borrowing from this, beginning with this guy who was asking questions about, why we do what we do, and then going into, the very ethereal ideas of Plato and the much more practical approach of Aristotle. But it's really just 3 generations, that Aristotle, is working only, 40 years after Socrates dies. And then after Aristotle, there are other very important developments in Greek philosophy. That's the emergence of the Stoics, for example, of the Epicureans. But in many ways, there's a famous quote that all Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's still kind of true, and that he asked the questions that we're still grappling with. Plato also famously devised his Republic. This, it's kind of just a thought experiment, but, what an ideal society would look like. And he, hated the democracy of Athens, which had killed Socrates. And so comes up with this sort of, almost an authoritarian state in which there are philosopher kings who govern all, the entire city. And then there are guardians, and there's this very kind of regimented, orderly universe that looks like a very intellectualized Sparta in some ways. But anyway, this has a very long legacy too. And so these 3 guys, and above all, Plato and Aristotle, who write copiously, really define the rest of the ancient philosophical tradition. They ask the questions that we're, as I said, still grappling with today.
Yeah. So, I mean, the questions, it almost sounds like, and correct me if this is not right, but like a mysticism or Gnostic or like,
Yeah,
are they questioning the nature of self, the nature of reality, the nature of beliefs, the nature of truth? Like
Well, yeah. I mean, so Plato, there was a very esoteric side to Plato. He was supposedly much taken with this Pythagorean idea that numbers have a mystical value, for example. That there's kind of this underlying
sacred
reality.
geometry kind of stuff? Or?
We don't know much about it. It's frustrating because we only have this reported to us, and only a few of his later dialogues get into this, the Timaeus especially. The idea that there's the geometries too, that the idea of the forms is based on this principle, as I mentioned before, that everything we see around us is a pale reflection of some deeper reality. And he thought that mathematics, which, is known kind of instinctively, you're not taught mathematics, it's just true and you learn it, is sort of a key to there being this underlying sense in which, that there's a higher reality that's reflected in the symmetries and the order of mathematics and geometry especially. But this is more as hinted at than said explicitly in his dialogues. So we aren't totally sure what exactly he was thinking about. And his ideas changed quite a bit over time, too.
Okay. You mentioned Pythagoras, and so maybe talk a little bit about him. What I've learned from talking to prior guests is that there's a good chance that Pythagoras went to Egypt and learned a lot of math, and he obviously was the guy who created the Pythagorean theorem, and that he came back and then started a school of mathematics and got into some very mystical kind of stuff. And I just was curious if you felt that his trip to Egypt had an impact on him and what he did when he got back to Greece.
We know little about Pythagoras directly. He wrote nothing that we have, and all the lives that we now possess are written quite a bit afterward. They say the same sort of things, that he's from the island of Samos in the eastern Aegean, that at some point in middle age he went to Egypt, and he probably did. We're not sure, but he probably did, and then ended up in southern Italy, where he kind of founds this school that becomes very influential and has many disciples. And there's sort of 2 Pythagorases in our tradition. One is this kind of mystical teacher who's focused on the fate of the soul in the afterlife. He believes in transmigration, that souls leap, after death to animals, to other people, and is said to have had this capacity to work wonders of various kinds. He has a golden thigh, whatever that means, supposedly. He can fly around, stuff like that. And also this mathematical sense that, again, we aren't sure how much of what Plato seems to believe later on comes directly from him or from his school. But this idea that numbers, as seen in the theorem, the famous theorem, there's this underlying reality that numbers reflect. As for how much it takes from Egypt, we don't know of any counterpart to this in Egypt. Egyptian theology, it might have existed, it does seem like in some ways, the Greeks thought Egypt was the oldest civilization, and they respected it quite a bit for that reason. And so they tended to, when someone had an interesting and especially a mystical idea, tended to assume that he got it from the Egyptians because it was so old, so prestigious, so fascinating to them. And that might have been the case, at least to some degree, but it might have just been also that they just assumed he got it from Egypt, and we aren't sure.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because the Great Pyramid is a 3-4-5 triangle.
Right.
It's which is a Pythagorean triangle. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared.
Right,
and,
right.
The bent pyramid is also Pythagorean triangle. The top half of the bent pyramid is a 3-4-5. I mean, there's all kinds of this math and stuff that Pythagoras seemed to bring back to Greece that we find built within the structures, encoded within the structures of a lot of these ancient temples within Egypt. So, for me, it was not a stretch to think that he, learned a lot of that from the Egyptians, because we see it clearly in the structures.
Yeah, the Greeks are immensely impressed by Egypt. They have a trading colony at a place called Naucratis pretty early on, like the 7th century onward. And it seems like their whole idea of architecture is, in many ways, an attempt to translate their own temples, which are very rudimentary and wooden originally, into the monumentality they found in Egypt. So the idea of using stone columns, for example, might have come from Egypt. They end up making things that are very different from what the Egyptians had ever produced in their temples and their tombs. But the idea of monumentality is very much Egyptian-inspired. So, I mean, I'm by no means saying it's impossible that he did learn something important or was inspired there. We just can't be sure.
Yeah,
so often there's these huge gaps in our record in ancient history.
What about the economy in Greece? Like, what were they? What were they? Was it coins? Obviously, I mean, what was that like, and how did it meet its demise, or was it a successful? What was that all about?
Sure. So the Greek world is broken up into several hundred city-states, each of which has its own little economy, its own little coins, its own take on the universe. It's kind of anarchic in some ways. They're trading, they're fighting. It's a very unstable world. Athens is the biggest and richest of these cities. There are others in Sicily that are almost as big, Syracuse, for example. But in the Aegean world, it's Athens that drives the economy. And their coinage, the famous owls, come from the silver mines at Laurion, I mentioned before. There's the big tetradrams, the 4 drachma pieces, and the drams, both made of pure silver. And they circulate, there we go, they circulate throughout the Mediterranean world. This is like the trade coin of the whole Eastern Mediterranean, because it's a coin that's purity is known and is produced in massive quantities. And so that's Athena and her owl there. Yeah, they are. They're wonderful coins. I have one, actually.
Cool. Yep.
Not quite as pretty as this one. And so their economy is driven by trade, of course, by commerce. The Athenians have these trade colonies, basically, in the northern Aegean and in the Black Sea. So they get grain from what's now Ukraine to feed Athens. They take timber from the northern Aegean, slaves, amber, other things from the north. They trade with Egypt. They trade with the Near East as well. All the luxuries of the East that they come into Athens from those directions.
Silk
does in small quantities. It's already coming through. Much bigger in the Roman period. The Romans loved their silk. And get it via India, actually, from China in many cases.
Okay.
And all these different coinages. The Athenian one's the biggest. It's they're all silver at this period, but each city has a rival coinage. Like Aegina next door, for example. What does happen though is in the 4th century BC, when Alexander conquers the Persian Empire, Persia is immensely wealthy, vastly wealthier than anything the Greeks could dream of, really. They have a pretty poor country. It's rocky, it's mountainous. There's not much agriculture.
Why are they so wealthy?
The Persians?
Yeah.
Because they possess the richest part of the ancient world, which is Egypt and Mesopotamia. And these are immensely wealthy regions. They have big cities, Mesopotamia especially. The Nile has its bumper crops every year.
Right.
And because agriculture is the origin of wealth, really, in the ancient world, this makes them very, very rich.
Gotta have food first, right?
Gotta have food first. Yeah. They also, because their empire goes all the way to India, or nearly to India, have access to those luxuries. Everything from tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli, all these other things that the rest of the world wants. And when Alexander conquers this vast empire in the 330s and 320s BC, he gains its huge reserves of gold and silver, which then flood back into the Greek world and really almost swamp its economy because there's so much silver around suddenly. There's quite a bit of inflation, as happened in the New World, or rather because the Spanish found the New World and its very wealthy silver mines like Potosi. There was a price revolution in Europe where there was massive inflation. But it did also spark the European economy because there's just more silver around suddenly. And so the Greek economy is not so much destroyed, it just becomes part of a much larger, more globalized economy because of Alexander. And then the Romans end up absorbing this economy when they conquer the Eastern Mediterranean and making it part of their own kind of large free trade zone.
Okay, fascinating. So then, so there was a coin that I saw, and Ryan, I don't know if you can find this, but I thought it was super interesting. It had what looked like a flying saucer in the sky.
Oh.
And so I don't, but it was on X. So I think it's legit. I think it's a legit coin, but I don't know. But
there's I think it'd be Boeotia, like Thebes would made. They were shield coins.
Yeah,
maybe that's what it is.
I think so.
Okay. Well, that's not an ancient coin, of course, but I do like it.
Yeah, that's not the one. But that I think that was the explanation, that it was a shield in the sky, basically amongst the clouds, and so
I don't know. I mean, the coin that I'm thinking of anyway is just a straight up shield.
Okay.
But I mentioned, we talked last night about this a bit, that there's a famous story, or there's a Roman record of them seeing burning shields in the sky.
Right.
And we know if those like lenticular clouds over the mountains, if those are some volcanic phenomenon, it's hard to say. But that's the only thing we really get about kind of flying saucers in our literary record anyway of the ancient world.
Yeah, how many reports of that, and what do they actually say, like in terms of the...
It's just the Romans were fascinated by the idea of prodigies, of signs from the gods. So anything that was weird, they would record. The idea of it being a possible benefit to interpret what happened afterward. Yeah. The gods gave us this sign, and then this happened. So, two-headed cow was born, and then, there was a fire in Rome. A equals B. All we have is this kind of brief mention, really, that, I think this is in the 2nd century BC, that they saw these odd clouds that looked kind of like, burning shields high up in the sky. And that's it. They didn't try to interpret it because they didn't have an idea of aliens. They thought that there were other planets, of course, which might have been inhabited by the gods, possibly, or by the dead in some ideas, but not by beings from beyond our our system. They didn't have an idea of that existing.
Right.
Some thought there were infinite worlds, but they weren't inhabited worlds, really, in the way we conceptualize them now.
And 200 BC, so I'm sorry, I missed it. Did you say it was the Romans that
This is the Romans.
The Romans.
This comes from.
Okay. But the Greeks didn't record anything about...
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, we have probably
Very little.
1% of what was written in the ancient world.
And why is that? That is this the Library of Alexandria is a part of that issue, that we've lost a lot of information about the Greeks from that? Is that the primary culprit?
It's more that that's symptomatic of a larger problem. That the Library of Alexandria is the biggest library for sure, and it's destroyed probably by Caesar, actually, but also by a series of disasters in late antiquity. It's not so much that library being burned that made us lose so much. It's that every library decayed in late antiquity. People stopped copying the books. It wasn't so much that they were all destroyed by one big disaster, so they became to be concentrated in a few places only, mostly monasteries, and then Constantinople, the city. And so in the Dark Ages, that books in the ancient world are a luxury item. Maybe 10% of people can read at the high end, maybe less than 10%. And the ones who are rich enough to buy books are a very small minority. Once this class of people dissolves in late antiquity, no one's paying for books to be copied anymore.
Late antiquity being?
Between about 400 and 700 AD.
Okay.
So the early Middle Ages, really, the fall of the Roman Empire into the early Middle Ages. And this era, when the old class that had books being copied just doesn't exist anymore. They're not copied. They just rot on the shelves, basically. And what is saved goes to monasteries, mostly sacred literature, but a few of the classics, like Virgil, for example, Ovid, people like that. Whatever's not gathered into those safe havens just decays. It is lost that way. And then in Constantinople, where there is still a court, still a Roman emperor and a Roman court, there are a few places that are still copying books in the Dark Ages. But besides that, they just kind of vanish because no one cares anymore. No one can read them or cares to commission new copies of them, and That's it.
So we know very little about the whole civilization then, and kind of, we're left with what we're left with, a small percentage in terms of the writing, 1% or so, and,
Yeah,
structures and,
we have a lot of stray evidence, I would say.
Yeah.
We know more about the Romans than we know about any other ancient civilization because, sure, we've lost a lot of writing, but we still have quite a bit. We have, if you look at the shelves that contain the sources in Greek and Latin.
The Greeks I'm talking about.
Oh, the Greeks, yes. So we have, there's this series called the Loeb Classical Library that tries to preserve and translate to English most of our sources in the classical world. And the Greek version of this, there are these green-bound volumes, would cover about 2 floor-to-ceiling bookcases. That'd be it, pretty much. We have other ways of knowing, of course. We have archaeology, which does show us. Oh, there we go. There's the lobes. The red ones are Latin, green ones are Greek. We have archaeology, which helps us a lot, though it's hard to interpret sometimes. We have coins. We have millions of coins, which do help us provide, everything from iconography to the metal standards. But it is true that there are just absolutely vast voids in what we know and what we can know about the Greeks and Romans.
Yeah, I want to ask you, don't let me forget to ask you about that little device that no one knows what it is.
The Dodecahedron.
Yes, thank you. Yeah,
the weird dice-looking things.
Yeah, let's talk about that when we get to Rome.
Sure, right.
More so. But okay. So then, just kind of finishing off on Greece then, what about, is there any evidence of people using drugs, using psilocybin, because when I hear what I hear about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, it's very different, unique thinking, which can manifest through the use of psychedelics. I want to ask you about specifically, I guess, Eleusis.
Yes.
Brian Murarescu wrote a fascinating book on that, with a fascinating theory about the Greeks journeying to a city of Eleusis and meeting the oracle and going through this whole, drinking the koukia or whatever it is.
Yes.
And, going through all these rituals. What is the evidence, if any, from your mind for the use of psychedelics within ancient Greece?
Yeah, there is quite a bit we read from ancient Greece, and you're thinking, this guy must have been tripping when he wrote this. But so it's one of these voids I mentioned where we just don't know. Well, we're aware that some of their neighbors, the Greeks' neighbors, did use drugs. The Scythians, who live in what's now Ukraine, for example, use marijuana. They throw hemp on hot coals, and they kind of have these steam baths where they kind of just kind of hang out in the smoke, basically. They do this. We have good evidence, both archaeology and literary evidence for them doing this. The Minoans in ancient Greece, so this is the Greeks before the Greeks in the Bronze Age, they used opium, we're fairly sure, in some rituals. But we just don't have that evidence, clear evidence, in the classical era. We know that they used opium pretty heavily for medical purposes. So like for someone in childbirth, for example, or extreme pain. They knew that you could overdose in opium, for example. People committed suicide this way sometimes. They'd have too much opium. It's hard to say, though, if they used it in any way for rituals. It's just not recorded. With Eleusis, so this is the most famous ritual in Greek religion. Eleusis is located about 14 miles from Athens. It's this sanctuary that's kind of the border of Athenian territory. And it's for the goddesses, Demeter and Persephone, basically. As I'm sure you know this from your reading. But so Demeter is the goddess of agriculture. Persephone is her daughter. And Persephone, the myth goes, is taken by Hades down to the underworld. And Demeter, in her mourning, lets all the crops on earth die. And so it's her being reunited with her daughter that the ritual, the mystery, celebrates the return of spring, of green, of life to the world. And the idea is that anyone who takes part in this ritual will themselves become part of this rejuvenation, that their own soul will have a happier afterlife. The Greeks have a pretty grim idea of the afterlife in general. You're kind of this flitting bat-like ghost. It's not very pleasant. And so the idea that you could have this happier afterlife if you took part in these rituals, if you were like Persephone, brought up from the underworld by the grace of Demeter, and rejuvenated like spring. That's the basic idea anyway. And anyone could take part in this ritual. If you were slave or free, If you knew Greek, that was the only requirement, you could take part. Even barbarians would come, even Romans would show up. So the famous thing that happens is there's this long ritual that they carry a piglet, actually. They toss it into the sea. It's this whole kind of odd thing. And they bathe it in the sea, and they toss it in a pit. But then they go in the culminating night of the ritual is in this building called the Telesterion, this big closed hall. And there they experience what seems to be a very dramatic ritual. There's flashing lights. There are strange noises. It appears to be some kind of recreation of Demeter bringing agriculture into the world, basically. And they drink this concoction, which has it's water, barley flour, and I think pennyroyal is what it was compounded from. And there's this theory that the barley was contaminated with ergot, this fungus that causes visions, hallucinogenic visions. But the problem is that that's very possible. That happens to barley. But they wouldn't know how to control that, of course. So it would happen unpredictably sometimes to certain people. But there's just no evidence for it because you wouldn't have traces in the goblets or anything. I don't think there's a lot of speculation about this, obviously, and most of it, I think, as a historian, can be a little irresponsible. I think you have to kind of stick to the evidence as far as you can. We shouldn't be arrogant about the past. We have to admit we don't know things. There's a ton we'll never know about the past. But in this case, where there is just no positive evidence for it happening, I have to be a skeptic. Just kind of, that's what I do.
Okay. Yeah, I'm totally open either way. It feels like every civilization has found a way to find some drugs somewhere.
I'd be surprised if it wasn't more widespread than we assume it is, honestly. Because like you said, even though wine is their drug of choice in the classical world, they would spike it with like mandrake, which would make it kind of a heady experience.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Okay. So I guess in terms of ancient Greece, like what else, or what's the most unique or unexplainable structure that they built? Like, were they ever moving any massive blocks around anywhere, or what's up with that?
So the most famous, monolithic things come a bit later. So like Baalbek is a Roman era temple, for example. But the Greeks do move enormous stones. When they're first inspired by Egypt, they try and build these, gargantuan temples, which have, 30 and 40 ton architrave blocks, as the blocks that connect the columns. Unlike the Egyptians and the Romans, they don't make their columns as one big chunk, monolithic. They're often built to be these huge drums, which might weigh still 20 tons apiece. And we should know how they moved them because they write about this. It's very primitive. They just fill the temple with earth initially and just drag it up these dirt ramps up to this, the block, and then the architrave. This is pretty rudimentary. Later on, they develop cranes, pretty elaborate cranes and pulleys in the 5th century BC, we think. And these become the way they move their stones around.
And how heavy of a stone could these cranes lift?
So there's one block. There's a very large temple at a place called Didyma in what's now Western Turkey. And I think the lintel, or the block over the door in this temple is gigantic. And they used, I think, 2 cranes in tandem to do that. We have a record of this. We actually had the lifting bosses, these knobs of stone they would wrap ropes around and bring them up. They used treadwheel cranes. People have a giant hamster wheel, pretty much, with like 5 or 6 guys inside. They'd be moving, walking the inside of this wheel. They would wind this drum, and the rope would be wound around it, and they would bring the stone up with it. And they have capstans, these drums with levers that would be turning. So they knew how to really economize on manpower in some ways to move stones that were 20 or 30 tons. But the really gigantic stuff, there's Didyma there, actually.
The capstone you're talking about is on the top?
The really big one, I think, has fallen, unfortunately.
Okay.
It's like it was over the main door, like that closed bit, the cella bit.
Gotcha.
But still, even those drums each weigh 10 tons. And the blocks on top, that's the architrave, are again gigantic.
So when you're saying drums, that column right there is split up into 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5 or 6 different. Probably like 15. They're all.
They're probably each one is about 4 feet high.
Right.
But they're huge. They're 8 feet across.
Yeah.
And so I've been to one of the quarries. You can see how they carved them out and then split them off. They'd actually would roll them sometimes. As drums out to the construction site.
And the Egyptians were doing columns like this in spots, but it was one single column.
Yes, monolith.
Yeah.
And the Romans were so impressed by that, they did the same thing, using Egyptian quarries, actually. After they took Egypt, the quarries at Aswan and at Mons Claudianus in the eastern desert, they would carve up to 60-ton, columns from granite, haul them across this burning waste, the desert, the Nile, up the Nile, across the Mediterranean to Rome. They didn't have to do that. They were so impressed that they were more durable, these big granite columns.
Right. Yeah, it seems like the Greeks and Romans really struggled to keep up with, the massive blocks that the Egyptians were moving around.
They were the masters of, of monoliths and of moving these things with what seems like very rudimentary technology.
Well, there's no, it's ropes and sleds and water.
Right, and a lot of manpower,
and apparently a lot of manpower.
Yeah,
and nobody's really been able to prove how that works yet. So it's interesting. It's a great theory, but it's not proven yet.
Yeah, I'm trying to think that there's a relief. I think it's a tomb of some guy named Jehuda Hotep, and I can't spell that. It's a Middle Kingdom relief, and it shows a couple hundred guys pulling this like 60-ton statue, I think. And there's a dude on the edge of the sled with like a water bucket, kind of like I'm sure you've seen it, kind of pouring it over to lubricate the track. That's all we have, I think. And for like showing the process.
Right, but they're moving 1,000-ton blocks, and sometimes 60s.
Oh, there it is.
Great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's the guy on the sled.
Yeah.
And
that's from, and that is. When was this relief?
I think it's Middle Kingdom.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure it's, I don't know when, maybe 18th century BC or something.
Right.
1900 BC.
Oh, okay, there we go.
1900 BC. So, this could be what they thought was a recreation of how it was done, or this could be them showing us how it was done, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think that the idea is that this guy was a nomarch, a governor, and he made this statue, and he was so proud of it that he showed, how he moved it around. But this was relatively small. We know that there are statues like Ramses. I think it's in the Ramesseum there's like 1,000-ton statue, like you said.
Yeah.
And this is, this is a tiny fraction of that size.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, just sitting there on a wooden sled.
Yeah, just kind of chilling. I don't know how you got that job, right?
Right.
Be sled guy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, interesting. So, okay, so they weren't moving megalithic blocks around, like massive megalithic blocks around on the regular.
Not in the same way that the Egyptians did or the Romans would. And another thing is that the Greeks, they don't have empires. They're city-states, and so their manpower, their resources are much more limited than a pharaoh or an emperor would have. That's part of it, I think, a big part of it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that for me, in terms of Greece, kind of wraps it up. It's what else did we miss though for you? Like what would be something that would really blow the audience away about what the Greeks were doing or what they accomplished?
I guess I would just say, in more of a general sense, that that in many ways the stuff the Romans did. It's just the stuff the Greeks did put into Latin, put into a Roman medium. The Romans were so impressed by the Greeks that everything they did, really, in architecture, short of cement anyway, in literature, in sculpture and art, is just copied from the Greeks. It's more than just a straight copy. They do their own thing with it. But this civilization is so brilliant that the Romans just say, okay, I want that. They're gods, just the Greek gods, different names. And because the Romans latch on to this, that becomes European civilization. Via the Romans, what the Greeks did becomes what we do in all kinds of ways, from democracy to our idea of having art. Actually, there's a fun thing then. So Alexander and friends conquer Central Asia. They go deep into as far as Pakistan, Uzbekistan, all of that, and they bring with them Greek statues. So there are Greek cities in what's now Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, all these places, and their idea of sculpture comes into Buddhism. So before this, the Buddha had been shown aniconically, just as like footsteps, or a lotus tree, that kind of thing. But then there's this cross-pollination where they start showing the Buddha as a Greek sculpture, as a Greek god, basically, with the elaborately pleated robes, with a realistic face. And so the whole tradition of Buddhist sculpture comes from the Greeks via Alexander and friends conquering Central Asia.
Wow.
So you find it in weird places.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. What were they using? Like, what was their weapons? What was the army like as they at this time period?
Yeah, so Alexander's army, it was a phalanx, and they had these very long pikes called sarissas. And so they'd march in these deep formations, and then they would, when it came time for battle, they'd form this hedgehog of iron spikes, beyond the front of the formation. There'd be 5 points out beyond the first man. So it's this unstoppable, hedge of metal coming at you. And at the same time, there would be cavalry flanking the enemy from the other side. And so the traditional idea, at least, is that this Alexander's army would immobilize the force they were facing, the infantry force they were facing, while the cavalry flanked them and destroyed them from the rear. And the phalanx in front just steamrolled over them because they're unstoppable. Before this, in the classical era, most Greek soldiers are hoplites. So they're heavy infantry with a short spear, basically, fighting in close, dense formations. And a lot of it is the psychology and almost the physics of kind of shoving, your opponent with this heavy shield and then jabbing with your spear opportunistically. So they tend to be kind of pretty short battles, but ferocious ones.
Yeah, just gruesome, violent, bloody.
Right. There we go. Yeah, so that's a phalanx, a hoplite.
So they weren't using. None of the troops were using like the bow and arrow at this point in time, or
there would be lighter forces attached to them sometimes, like slingers, for example,
Okay.
or archers. But the core of a city-state's army would be hoplites, heavy infantry.
okay.
And in many ways, the Roman legionary is kind of a take on this. It's the same thing, close order, heavy infantry. But the Romans fight in a much looser formation than the phalanx, and that's the key, in the maniples of the legion, which allows them to kind of envelop, their phalanx opponents.
I used to, when I played high school football, I returned kicks, and we used to run the phalanx.
Really?
That's what my coach would call it. Yeah,
Oh, that's great.
Coach Dowling. And so, everybody would just basically form a V and run straight forward, and I would have to run behind the phalanx, and they would just try to just push everybody out to the side. He was our history teacher as well.
Oh, that's great.
So it was Beall, run the phalanx, get the ball to Beall. You got to run through the middle. And Coach Dowling's a legend. That school, my high school, has won 2 out of the last 3 Florida State national championships. So
they're doing something right.
They're doing something right.
Yeah.
For sure. But that was always a blast. And I think it's the reason I can't complete sentences as I sit here and speak with you today.
That's right.
Matt, do you mind if I ask a
please,
question?
Ryan, jump in, man.
Going back to kind of some of the hoplites and things like that, when it came to their military, is it similar in the fact that it is today, where it's volunteer and you can make a career out of it, and most citizens don't choose to do it, or did males of that time not have a choice when the enemy was over the ridge?
Mm-hmm. In many ways, the Roman army, the Roman imperial army, is much like a modern professional army. People sign up for 25 years. It's a career. You're given a big discharge bonus. Your life is tied to the camps. And after you retire, often you kind of keep living near your old camp, and your son's going to the military. It becomes this generational thing. But the Greek city-states, before Alexander, it's a militia. They're called up for a single campaign for a few weeks often. That's it, in the summer between the harvests. It's expected that you fight for your city. It's not necessarily obligatory. There's no draft, but it's kind of part of what you do. It's kind of the core duty, really, you have as a citizen, is to fight for your city-state. But you own your own armor. It's not given to you, and there's no career in the military. You just kind of show up, and when you're called up for a campaign, fight for a few weeks and go back home. There are mercenaries in the Greek world who are professionals, who are kept on for years and years by certain city-states. But it's not really until Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, creates a real professional army. His state is big enough and wealthy enough to have a professional army. You have true careers, I would say, in the way that we might think of it in the Roman sense or the modern sense. Yeah. So a good question.
Yeah, makes sense for sure. Okay, so then maybe lastly on the Greeks then would be the Trojan War, and so I know that's fascinating to a lot of people, but I don't know a whole lot about it, to be honest with you. So kind of maybe educate me on some of the more fascinating, cooler aspects of that.
Sure. So the Trojan War, as we have it in Homer's Iliad, is this epic 10-year struggle between a coalition of Greek kings and the Trojans, who have this wealthy city on what's now northwestern Turkey, and their allies. And it becomes this kind of epic, world-shaking struggle, as Homer says it. The gods divide amongst themselves, and they help each side. They're allies from every part of the known world. But Troy is so mighty that the Greeks can't take it, and eventually they do with the famous Trojan horse. The Iliad focuses on the greatest of the Greek heroes, Achilles, and his refusal to fight for a long time because he's having a fight with Agamemnon, the greatest Greek king. But the Iliad is the absolute centerpiece of Greek education. People learn to read from the Iliad, and they try to apply, its lessons to all kinds of things, from ethics to Anything you can imagine, the Iliad is a reference that's made, it's their Shakespeare, basically. Their Shakespeare, their Bible, their everything is the Iliad. So the Trojan War is this culturally central thing for the Greeks, and for the Romans by extension, because the Romans believe that their founding father, Aeneas, is a Trojan prince who fled the ruins of Troy and was brought by the gods to Italy, where he intermarried with the local Italians and, was the progenitor of the Roman people.
Okay.
So how much of this is historical is a real question.
Right.
The Greeks themselves thought it all happened around 1200 BC, long before their own time, in other words. They settled on, I think, it's 1183 BC, 1184 BC. And there's a great kind of a hiatus in Greek history, and that is what we call the Late Bronze Age collapse. So if there was a historical Trojan War, it was fought by the Mycenaeans, the Greeks before the Greeks, and against someone else, the Trojans, probably an ally of the Hittites, perhaps. And then this would have happened right before the Mycenaean civilization, this very elaborate civilization that was based in the citadels, like Mycenae and Tiryns, collapsed completely. Writing was forgotten. The publishing collapsed. And the Greece that emerged, the archaic Greece I mentioned before, in 800 BC, is a very different civilization. It's kind of built on the ruins of this half-forgotten Bronze Age world. And so there's really two questions. One is, was there a historical Trojan War? And second, if there was, how is it remembered, and how much of it was remembered? And for the first question, so we have the Hittites, the people who ruled most of what's now Turkey, basically, Anatolia, and some archived documents from the Hittite palaces mention some names that sound like Trojan names from Homer as vassals in the area around what we think is Troy. We actually found the city Troy in the 19th century, this guy Heinrich Schliemann, and claimed famously to have discovered Homer City. But whether it was or not, we aren't quite sure. If there was a place that happened, it was there, but the Romans said it was there. So anyway, there's definitely a conflict happening between Mycenaean kings and local princes, who are probably vassals of the Hittites, in the area around the place remembered as Troy. But which of these became the Trojan War? We aren't quite sure. And it's all oral poetry. It's not written down. And so there might have been this tradition of, this amazing fight, off in the edge of the Greek world that's handed via oral bard to oral bard over the centuries to the time of Homer, who, if he was one person, lived probably around 700 BC, give or take. And he, if he was, again, one guy, put these stories together into this brilliant literary form that becomes this kind of central epic for Greek civilization. So there's just a lot of ifs. And if you go to Troy today, it's what the Greeks and Romans thought where Troy was. You see 9 cities on top of each other on this big mound at Tell. And if there was a Troy, it was probably the 7th of those cities, which flourished around 1200 BC, give or take, and was destroyed violently, we think, by enemies. But whether it was the Greeks who did it, whether it was some local thing that was magnified by later oral tradition, we just aren't sure. So as so often in the ancient world, we just can't be quite positive. But there's probably some kernel there, something that was transmitted. It's just hard to say how much and how.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to follow, and I keep saying we're closing out on Greece, but
sure.
But I'm going to follow up maybe with an absolutely crazy question for you. And Ryan, I'd like you to maybe just pull up, because I don't know what the supporting data is for this, but I've talked to a couple of guests about giants, and like that whole phenomenon, and there's some ancient Greek tie-in with one of the cities, and I'm blanking on it right now, but I wanted to get, at least from AI, Ryan, if you could, the perspective of why there are thoughts and theories that giants may have existed in the past, and then have you be able to, if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So the Greeks, when you discover, of course, any bones in the ground, human bones, they spread out, of course. They're not articulated anymore. All the sinews are gone. And so they seem spread out. They seem bigger. But the Greeks routinely mistook the bones of mastodons, of woolly mammoths, and even of older creatures as human bones. So they would think that when they find this mastodon, femur or something, this was, some dude who was 15 feet tall.
Right.
And simply, it's often fossils that are misinterpreted as human remains. Actually, there's a wonderful story in the Roman era. Some guy for the Emperor Tiberius he imagined a skull, what this thing would have looked like. He tried to reconstruct the face from this probably mastodon head. and it's this grotesque creature with like a cart-sized head, based on these misinterpreted bones. They find, I think it's a whale skeleton at one point in the Roman era, and that they again interpret this as a mythical monster of some sort. There's all kinds of other things. They think that griffins, for example, are based on these bones found in Central Asia.
Okay.
They think they find the bones of Theseus, the great hero of Athens, on an island in the Aegean, and it might be a mastodon again. We're not totally sure. And they bring these bones back and bury them ceremoniously in the middle of the agora, near the agora. Cyclopses, famously. So they're the one-eyed monsters.
Yeah.
If you look at like an elephant's skull, they have this big cavity in their forehead. And the idea is that this was the origin of the Cyclops myth. They found, these Ice Age elephant skulls and thought they were these giant one-eyed creatures. And so there is a lot of kind of misconstrued paleontology, I guess, in the Roman and Greek worlds.
It's interesting. It
is fascinating.
It's so shocking to me that humans at any point in time could mistake a mammoth for a human. It's like it just seems so. And I get it. We don't think that there were, and so that's what the theory is as to why. Because I think they did think that that's what they found, I guess, or that's what they wrote about.
They assumed that the heroes of the past, that the people like Achilles, for example, were gigantic. That they were 8 feet tall, bigger than men today, and they could. Homer has a famous line where he could lift a boulder that 4 men couldn't lift now, and hurl it, and they're larger than life, quite literally. And so, it's sort of their assumption that these guys are huge.
Yeah.
And, so they find any bone at all, they fit it, into this scheme.
Yeah.
And they also have kind of a more general sense of what human is. That there's humans, there's kind of part humans like centaurs and satyrs, for example, or mermaids, and there are monsters. They're these creatures that kind of are beyond, our comprehension. And so we have this kind of hard and fast idea of biology, that things are categorized very neatly. There's humans, there's primates, there's whatever else. To them, it's kind of a spectrum that's much looser, I guess. So they can imagine these kind of inhuman monsters. They don't look very human-like, but still fit their mental category of, being a giant or being this mythical monster.
Gotcha. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, the only reason that I'm even comfortable enough to ask the question with a straight face really is because of the findings that we've had with the Denisovans as of late.
Oh, those are the East Asian primitive humans, right?
No,
they're kind of all over Asia, aren't they? I'm trying to remember.
We don't know. I mean, there's only been a few fossils found. There's only been a few ancient human Homo sapiens.
That's true, right? We have so little of the fossil record.
Yeah. So with the Denisovans, there's been one skull that's been found,
right,
and it's about twice as big as the average human skull. There's been a molar that's been found, and the volume of the molar is, I'm sure Ryan could pull this up, it's twice as big as any human tooth that's ever been found. I mean, the molar is this big. There's been a pinky bone found that's just absolutely massive. And what people say is that, they just had a disproportionately large head and a disproportionately large molar and a disproportionately large hand, but their body was, 5.5 feet tall or something. And
I guess we just can't be sure, right? Unless we find a full skeleton. Wasn't it like the so-called hobbits? Was it Antikythera, I think? Oh, yeah, there we go.
Look at this Denisovan tooth versus a human molar. I mean, it's like, and
it's a big tooth.
That's the only reason. It's like, if people are saying that they've found giants in the past or found like giant bones, could it have been Denisovan bones that they were finding potentially?
We just can't know, obviously, because their anatomy is so vague. Like I said, that they found something that was like a genuinely large, enormous human. They wouldn't know necessarily, right, or they would just put in the same category as a whalebone. Augustus, the first emperor, had in one of his gardens the bones of 2 giants who actually had lived in his own time. They were like 9 feet tall. They were humans, and it's kind of this grotesque way. He had them displayed in his gardens, like propped up as wonders. So it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I was saying that wasn't it? I was at the island of Flores in Indonesia. They found these miniature humans, right?
Right. Dwarf. For sure.
Who were kind of the island effect. And so who knows? With primitive man, there might have been these species that look very different.
There's been all kinds of species of humans for sure. Yeah, and it's like, could some of them have been tall?
Possibly. Yeah,
That doesn't seem
I don't
crazy.
know, yeah.
Yeah, but well, cool. Okay, yeah. I mean, that's the Greeks. It's just it's such a fascinating culture, and it's kind of frustrating at the same time a little bit because there is so little
Right.
remaining about what they were actually doing, and it's like one discovery like the Antikythera device, or that could change our whole understanding of what they were capable of, what they really knew, what they understood. But it's fascinating to hear about the facts and the data of what we actually know, and kind of what our current theories are, which I know are always being updated and evolving.
Always. We assume that it's a closed book, but
Yeah.
there are still things to discover.
Yeah.
Archaeology has just begun in some ways across the Eastern Mediterranean. And from Egypt, we have these papyri that are found by the hundreds of thousands, at least fragments anyway, that are mostly still unread. They have to be pieced together, they have to be interpreted, but there's much more to learn.
All right. Well, okay. So then on to the Romans. Yeah, where did that kind of begin, and what was happening in early Rome?
Yes. So the Romans eventually settle on the date of 753 BC as the foundation of their city by Romulus and Remus. We think that's probably not too far off, honestly, probably a little before that, around 800 BC, give or take. There were all these villages on hilltops around the Tiber River, on the hills of Rome. And one of these small villages on the Palatine Hill, the later place of the emperor's palace, eventually incorporated the others, became the center of this growing city. Rome emerges at a time when the Greeks are in Italy, actually. The Greeks have colonized the south of Italy and Sicily. And it seems like from the very beginning there's contact with the Greeks. Greek merchants mostly are coming up the coast and selling pottery, other things. And they grow up in between these Greeks in the south and the Etruscans in the north. This very advanced civilization that takes to Greek culture quite a bit. They love Greek pottery, for example, and live in very rich city-states that the Romans are competing with from the very beginning. So the Romans emerge in this middle ground between the Greeks and the Etruscans in what they call Latium, the land of the Latins, as one of about a dozen competing city-states. But the Romans pretty early on become the most important of these city-states because they're on this bend of the Tiber River, the first ford of the Tiber, which is Central Italy's most important river. It gives them an important trade advantage. Merchants come through there. Two trade routes cross there. And this young city on the seven hills has kings initially, we think. There are 7 kings, according to tradition, who kind of preside over a growing city-state. It's not a massive power in the beginning, and it owes its advantage, if at all, to its institutions. It has a very strong aristocracy who eventually will found the Republic when they expel the last king and create this society that's very willing and very able to absorb others. When a Greek city-state fights another Greek city-state, they don't fight for permanent advantage, typically. They'll fight over disputed territory. They'll fight over a single shrine on their mutual border. It'll be a short war. One wins, one loses, and then they kind of just go home. But when the Romans fight a war, at least later on, they fight for keeps. They annex the rival city, and they make its elites part of their system. They make them citizens. The Greeks didn't share their citizenship very easily. The Romans, by contrast, do. They even give it to freed slaves, which is almost unique in the ancient world. And so the Romans have a system that's kind of primed for growth. They're very welcoming to their former rivals, make them part of their system. And so by the 4th century BC, Rome is the most important power in central Italy. They're also almost uniquely driven by war. So in the Roman system, it's kind of a competitive aristocracy that governs this republic, which is founded around 500 BC, give or take. And there are 2 consuls who each lead an army in times of war anyway, and other aristocrats who hold the other main offices. And they're all competing with each other for status, for prestige. And so the only way to get prestige, or the best way to get prestige, is to win a war. And so they are primed to be constantly fighting and constantly celebrating triumphs, which is your ultimate political currency under the republic. And so this system that's very good at absorbing people is also very good at conquering people and very motivated to conquer people. And so Rome expands bit by bit over the course of the 4th and 3rd centuries. They come to the notice of the Greek world in the 270s BC, when a Greek king, one of Alexander the Great's relatives actually, decides he wants to conquer a little empire in the south of Italy. And they come across these Romans who no one's ever really heard of before, who defeat him eventually with the best phalanx army that Greece can offer, and elephants too. And so the Romans had evolved through their, kind of constant fighting, this version of the hoplite army that we call the legions, that fought in a loose checkerboard formation, the maniples, that could envelop almost any other enemy. It was just very, very tough. These guys were fighting every year, had a lot of experience. They weren't professionals yet, but they were the next best thing. And the Romans also made their allies, the guys they were conquering, that they were taxed in men. They would give them troops for their campaigns. And so the Romans fought alongside these allies and who helped them conquer this ever-expanding empire. And so it was a machine in which conquest fed conquest. Every new city they added to their empire gave them new reserves of men, new reserves of money, and just more to work with for this aristocracy that wanted to conquer to get its own political, bona fides. And so it was really one of history's most efficient conquest machines. They defeated Pyrrhus, this Greek king who came. They conquered all of Italy by about 270 BC. And then the great challenge was the Punic Wars, was Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy city-state founded by people from what's now Lebanon, in North Africa, and now Tunisia. And they controlled most of the North African seaboard, west of Egypt, along with parts of Spain, and a very wealthy mercantile empire. Unlike the Romans, they were not quite as warlike. They had mercenary armies, but they were very effective. They were very, very wealthy, and they had this dynasty of generals, the Barcas, Hamilcar, and then his great son Hannibal, who gave the Romans a run for their money. But the Romans won these wars. They were long fought. The Second War especially, in which Hannibal marched over the Alps into Italy with his elephants, was defeated finally by Scipio and the other Roman generals. And by about the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome was indisputably the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, having conquered the whole western Mediterranean seacoast, Greece, and then soon the rest of the eastern Mediterranean seaboard. And so it was a kind of lightning expansion. The Greeks struggled to explain it, honestly. This historian named Polybius, who was a prisoner in Rome, wrote a long history in which he tried to explain the rise of Rome to his fellow Greeks. And he explained it as a combination of the Romans' native virtue, it's a very ancient way of explaining how people succeed, and also their government, which he thought combined the best elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, was very stable and was very prone to motivate people to campaign against their enemies and win.
And so the weapons and the strategy that the army was using, can we double click into that a little bit? Like, how were they defeating these armies?
Sure. It wasn't like they were all that much better armed, honestly, than their opponents. So the legionary is pretty much like a hoplite, where he's heavy infantry. Usually he has a breastplate, maybe greaves, a helmet, and a large shield. That's iron-bound anyway. And he'd have a couple weapons. At the beginning of an engagement, there we go. So this is the imperial version. And they're wearing the segmented armor that became popular in the 1st century. So they had a couple weapons. They had these javelins you see in the illustration, which they would throw at the beginning of a fight. And those were designed to bend when they hit an enemy's shields. They couldn't be reused. They would stick in the shield and then bend it. So the enemy had to drop his shield, ideally. Those are the pila. There we go. So he's holding his pilum there in his right hand. But their main weapon...
That's what they would throw?
At the beginning, yes. And so that was designed to bend after they threw it. And so the enemy couldn't, recover his shield. But after that, they would fight with their gladius. That's a short sword you see. It's about 1.5 feet long.
Number 6? Oh, no.
It's at his waist there, you see.
I see. Right. Sure.
That red sheath.
Yeah.
And it's a short stabbing sword, about 20 inches long, give or take. A model actually on a Spanish sword the Romans encountered in the Spanish Celts. But it's a brutally efficient weapon. It's kind of, there we go. So it's very tough. You just kind of, it's a stabbing sword, and you just jab. Polybius comments on the damage this does to people. It eviscerates them, basically.
Yeah, you're gone. You're dead.
One stab and you're done. So, it just jabs through armor.
Right.
And so, again, it's not pretty. It's not sophisticated. It's just guys in a line who are very well trained with the shield in the left hand, that stabbing sword in the right, just jabbing.
Yeah. And nobody in the world could defeat this at that time.
For a while. So these are the legionaries, and they were the auxiliaries, who are the allies initially, and they become part of the formal system later on. And they're often more lightly armed. So that's where the archers are, the slingers are there. There is cavalry, but not too much of it typically.
Okay.
So it's really an infantry fight.
Okay.
And the Romans are just better at this kind of fight than anybody else for a long time. Hannibal defeats them a few times and kills tens of thousands of legionaries. He's a smarter general, but his troops are not superior. He just has better plans. And eventually he comes against a Roman general who is as clever as he is, Scipio, and then he loses. Because these guys are not professionals yet. They're not hired for long periods, but they're fighting every year. So they have a huge amount advantage in experience against the militias they're fighting. If you're a barbarian, for example, you're fighting in raids, once a summer, you're fighting fellow tribes a couple times a summer, sure. But, it's a few weeks a year. These guys are in the field all summer, again and again and again. And so Julius Caesar, creates this famously proficient army in Gaul when he's fighting against these Gallic tribes. And his 10th legion, his favorite legion, becomes so good because they're just fighting in the field for a decade. Really, experience is the thing that separates the Roman soldiers from their opponents. They have better weapons in some cases. They have high-quality swords and shields, but they're just better at war because they've done it more.
And so when they're coming into a village or a city or whatever, and they're attacking and they're about to take over, is it just they just start killing people, or is there hey, if you join us now, then you can be a part of the great Roman Empire. Nobody has to die. What were the actual, how did that kind of work from a battle standpoint?
It was actually a pretty elaborate procedure. So originally, declaring war, for example, they would send an envoy who would formally throw a spear in enemy territory to say, hey, we're at war with you guys now. And they'd actually want to negotiate, if at all possible, because sieges are hard. So before, let's say they defeat the enemy in Beall, the enemy withdraws into their city and they're encircling them. They'll send an envoy again and say, hey, if you lay down arms now, open the gates, your lives will be spared. We'll ask for a certain amount of property, probably. We'll ask for an indemnity. We'll ask for, amount of gold. We won't kill anybody. If they refuse at that point, then their lives are forfeit. So at that point, the Romans commit to the siege. And if they break in, then the enemy has no rights under the rules of ancient warfare. And so then, the idea is that people are taken.
They're killing women and children, and
ideally they're taking them as slaves. Is what usually happens. A slave is worth something. Someone who's dead is not. But it's brutal. There's no way around it. And it's theatrically brutal in some ways. It's brutal in a way that's meant to be memorable to other people who try to resist the Romans. Polybius, this Greek historian, mentions that the Romans, they took one Spanish town, I believe it was, cut the bodies in pieces with their gladius, even any stray dogs they found, so that people would come later on and be terrified by what they had done. It's kind of the Genghis Khan approach, where you leave your pyramid of skulls as a way of saying, don't mess with me. We mean business. But in general, conquest is not that bloody. The enemy is defeated, the enemy king, let's say, in a battle, and the Romans just annex his territories. And they don't want to destroy the cities because that's their taxes in the future. And they might exploit them. They might overtax them. There might be abuses. But the idea is to keep people in place and to try to use them as much as possible for the revenues of Rome.
Is there any way to know throughout the entire conquest of Rome how many people were slaughtered?
It's in the millions.
Yeah.
I mean, there's guesses that, it's like Strabo, who's a Greek historian, talks about Caesar's conquest of Gaul and claims, I think, that he took 1 million captives, or more than 1 million captives, and killed 1 million more, which, if it's true, is incredible.
Yeah.
Because Gaul probably had a population of maybe, 7 or 8 million in total. And that's, I think, indicative of the scale of destruction that could be wreaked by the Romans when this happened. That's probably about right.
Wow.
And that's true of any conquest, but the Romans are just at it much longer and conquer, a much larger territory. And they don't want to kill everybody because, again, that's tax revenue they're destroying if they do it.
Right.
But
wars, there's risk.
There is, but wars are destructive.
PTSD.
Yeah, and that happens too. Yeah. We assume anyway.
Yeah.
But so it is a terribly bloody conquest, and even those of us who are Roman historians, shouldn't be apologists for the Romans. They are, bloody-minded conquerors when it comes down to it. What they build on the ruins of the world that they seize is the most long-lasting and stable civilization the world had ever known. And so that's kind of not the antidote, but the other side of what the Romans do is the Pax Romana.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's still, that mentality still exists within humanity today. You know? So it's not just the Romans, it's just that they had the ability to do it. But if there were there's plenty of other countries and leaders and dictators and people that would make the choice to do that if there was no repercussion, if there was no threat of nuclear war, if there was no threat of, that would have, I mean, that's been happening all throughout history, and it would be no different today.
Yeah, the drive to dominate is unfortunately wired into us, I think. Yeah. And the Romans do care about just wars. They don't declare wars willy-nilly. They do claim whenever they attack somebody that they deserved it. Either they attacked Romans first, or they had in some way provoked what Rome was doing. So there was this sense that there had to be a provocation. And even when they're doing these things, they do feel bad sometimes about what happens. There are stories about victims, who fall imploring the soldiers, and so they're not inhuman about the whole thing. But the cost is terrible. There's no way around it. And
so they go into the towns and they slaughter the people, or they don't, but they convert the town into a Roman town, and then. Do I understand this right? That like they're then installing their way of life within the town by growing grapevines for wine and setting up like these. They have these very specific things that they set up within each town. Can you maybe talk through what some of those things are?
Sure. Yeah, Roman cities tend to look very similar wherever they are in the world. Often they have this kind of neat checkerboard of streets. They have a forum in the center with a few public buildings and temples. And the people around are eating similar things. They're drinking wine. They're, eating wheat or barley bread. Often foods imported from the Mediterranean world. So the question becomes, did they impose this, or did the people they conquered adopt it freely? And the answer seems to usually be that the peoples that were conquered Romanized themselves in some way. There is, obviously coercion, like the Roman military camps are imposed on landscapes, and those are all built to the same standard. But often these cities that we see across Gaul or Britain or Spain are wealthy locals who say, "Hey, we're part of the Roman Empire now. I'm going to join the winning team. I'm going to, try and make myself as Roman as possible." And so they will learn Latin. They'll start wearing a toga if they become a citizen, for example, and they'll try to become the sponsor of these new cities, in which they say, "Let's make our city a little Rome." Because they know that they have much more scope for power, for advancement within this huge world-spanning empire than they ever would in their, local corner of Gaul. And so I mentioned before, the Romans are good at kind of making people part of their system, at appropriating people, hearts and minds. The Romans are very good at getting the loyalty of local elites, and they know this. So often it's these cities we see that look so similar, from the Sahara to, Britain, are local notables saying, "Hey, I'm going to become Roman. I'm going to have my kids learn Latin. I'm going to build this miniature Roman city or help build it." And it grows organically that way. The Romans do sometimes promote this. We hear about one Roman general who has like a school for kids to learn Latin, apparently, the sons of chieftains, for example. But this is the exception, we think, and not the rule. It's all people voluntarily joining the system.
Okay. So then, I mean, when did religion become a part of what they were implementing?
Yes. So the thing about polytheism is that it's very flexible, right? You can say that our God is kind of like your God, and live and let live. Whereas, of course, in a monotheistic system, it's one or the other. It's a hard choice. So when the Romans would show up in one of these places, they bring their gods with them, of course. And these local elites who are making their new kind of faux Roman cities say, "Hey, our God, Wotan or whatever, is kind of like your Zeus or your Jupiter. Let's worship them together." And so we have these temples that are built for nominally Roman gods, like Mercury or Mars or somebody. But it's actually the local god, local Celtic god, or the local Berber god, or whoever else, being worshipped in the guise of his Roman equivalent. So it's sort of a hybrid system. You have these many different variations of Roman religion that emerge in the provinces that are, fusions of a local pantheon and the Roman gods.
Okay. Yeah, and so, okay, so then I guess, Baalbek was something that I wanted to ask you about as well, because there's so much speculation about that and how old the foundation is with those big stones under there. And I know I asked you at dinner, and you told me that I was going to be disappointed because your answer is very boring. But tell me your kind of like, I guess, everybody's probably familiar with the stones, but you can summarize what those are and
Sure.
where they're found. And then What is the evidence that we have that those really are Roman stones?
Yeah, so Baalbek famously is in eastern Lebanon, and it was the Roman city of Heliopolis. The great stones, well, three of them anyway, the trilithon, are found in the foundations of the temple of Jupiter at Baalbek. And he's one of these hybrid gods. He's the local sky god who's been assimilated to the Roman Jupiter. And there, of course, are three more stones which are found in the quarries that were apparently too big to move, we think. This is one of them that's here in the picture. And the biggest of those, I think, is almost twice the size of the ones that are in the temple. The ones in the temple, I think, are about 700 tons, give or take, if I recall correctly.
I think they're about 1,000 tons.
Are they about 1,000?
Yeah.
And the ones that are found in the quarries are even larger.
Yeah,
up to like 1,500, I think.
Yeah, about that. Yeah, they're estimated, I think, 12 to 1650.
So here's the temple of Jupiter there, the six standing columns. And the stones are part of the foundations of that temple. So we have no reason to think that this temple is older, the building itself, than about the 1st century AD. We don't have the exact records, but there's graffiti, I think, on one of those columns. It's from like the reign of Nero. So I think it was there by then, give or take.
The Romans were there then.
Yeah. And it's definitely, the whole complex has evolved at about the same time, we think, by a newly rich aristocracy, local aristocracy, one of these Romanizing elites that's building this whole big complex to honor their local god in a Roman architectural language, basically. And so the mystery of why these huge stones are brought in and how, I guess it's kind of two components. One is, first of all, why would they do this? These gigantic rocks that they have no reason to use. And then the second, of course, is how they would do it. For the first, the why, this temple of Jupiter is gargantuan. It's meant to be huge. That building, when it was intact, was more than 100 feet high. And the stones beneath it, of course, are gigantic. It's the rhetoric of size. It's why they did obelisks in the first place in Egypt, for example, because it's just a big thing that's impressive and needs no explanation, no translation culturally. It's there. Its size speaks for itself.
Let's pull it up, Ryan, if you could, as we're talking, please, sir.
Yeah, it's the trilithon, I think it's called, are the ones in the foundation of the temple, which I'm sure you can find in a second.
Yep.
And so this rhetoric of size, that the whole temple is meant to be just gargantuan, monumental, to impress anyone who comes. There's no better way of doing this than to put these stones that are, here it is, that are 20 or 30 feet long in the foundation. You can't, it doesn't need explanation, like I said. It's there. It's gigantic. And I think that these even larger stones they apparently try to incorporate into the foundations are for the same purpose, to impress, to be astonishing. And there's the three big ones.
Now, yeah.
The trilithon.
Those are a couple of the massive ones.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they're from local quarries, right? They're from within a mile or two away. And from far as I know, we assume they're moved the way the Egyptians move stones, which is with huge teams of men, over lubricated surfaces, kind of a special trackway of some sort. Maybe log rollers, maybe not. We aren't totally sure. But it's obviously possible. They obviously did these things. They have been doing it for quite a long time. And we have no reason to think there was a sanctuary here before, a big one like this anyway, before the Romans showed up. All the masonry besides this looks very Roman. And so, for me, as a Roman historian, this all looks like this is all about the same age, the same vintage. And what they're doing with the stones is a very Roman kind of thing, which is, again, the rhetoric of size. We can do this, so we're going to do it. I do think, though, that it probably borrows from older traditions of monumentality that are coming from Egypt, almost certainly, because there's nothing here before this that's of a similar scale. People who had maybe gone to Egypt, these local elites, had seen this stuff and are trying to copy it in their own local temple. But we just don't know. We don't have any records of this. But that's my take on the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, you see the erosion on the big stones on the bottom versus the other stones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it looks like significantly more erosion on those large stones than on anything else that's kind of just stacked on top of it, right?
I mean, it could be. Again, I just don't know. I've never been to the site myself. They're limestone, I think.
Yeah, they are.
And I guess limestone does erode different ways, and it could be different kind of limestone. There's always ways to explain around it, obviously. And I get that it looks very different.
But it's all local.
It's the kind of thing that you wouldn't expect in an ordinary Roman temple. But to me, as a Roman historian, like I said, I'm conditioned to say, okay, kind of Occam's razor. What's the least, the most obvious thing we can say that, the way to explain the presence of these gigantic rocks in the Roman temple is just to say that they're trying to be kind of like the Romans and to show off in this very rhetorical sort of way with these gigantic stones.
It's a good story, but I mean, is it true, right? I mean, so are you 100% convinced that
No,
it's Roman?
I'm not, obviously, because I can't be.
Yeah.
Unless if we had hard proof one way or the other, then sure.
Yeah.
But the fact that again, there's, for me anyway, I'll say there's no reason to say it can't be Roman, and I guess I'd leave it at that pretty much.
Okay. Let's. I want to dive into that a little bit because
Sure.
the biggest other Roman stones that were moved from anywhere throughout the history of the Roman Empire was like 12 tons or something like that.
No, there's it's called Pompey's Pillar in Alexandria. It was Diocletian. It's a huge granite column, and I think that's 300 tons, give or take. So it's very, very big. It's obelisk sized, and obelisks too. So the Romans move, I think, 15 obelisks, more than that probably, maybe 24 obelisks, but 13 that are or 11 that are very large, all to Rome. And the biggest of these is called the Lateran obelisk. Yeah, there it is. It's Pompey's Pillar. And I think 300 tons, give or take. It's a monolith. And the biggest, the Lateran obelisk, again, I think, is several hundred tons, maybe 400 tons. And they brought it across the Mediterranean. That's quite a feat. So they carved it out in Aswan, down the Nile, over the Mediterranean, up the Tiber, and then through the streets of Rome to where it was set up in the Circus Maximus. So they had that capability to move very, very large stones. And, whether these examples here in Baalbek are the same, moved by the same method, or indeed are Roman, again, I can't say for sure. But to me, knowing that they move these other very large hunks of rock, it's not implausible, I guess.
So what, Ryan? Can we? This is new to me, so I want to learn about this.
Sure, yeah.
The other rocks. Can you pull up those other rocks that they were moving, Ryan?
Yeah, so it's the Lateran obelisk. It's near St. John Lateran in Rome.
Okay.
And they loved obelisks because they're impressive, right? Again, this rhetoric of size, the idea of having this huge hunk of granite. Often it is, from the New Kingdom in Egypt, and they take it down from Heliopolis or from Karnak or something, and there it is, and move it in one piece, and then put it back up somewhere in Rome. Actually, this one's been moved twice. It was put up first in the Circus Maximus, in Rome, and then it fell in the Middle Ages and was put up by one of the popes in the Renaissance. And yeah, it's huge. It's the biggest one we still have, actually, the biggest obelisk. There's the one that it has one that the unfinished obelisk, would have been much bigger, but they never, of course, took it out of the ground.
Right. That looks very small compared to the stones at Baalbek.
I think it's about 400 tons. It is smaller, yes, but it's still big.
Ryan, how heavy is it?
And they brought it, like I said, 1,000 miles.
455 tons.
455 tons.
So 32 meters tall, and then the monolith part is 32 meters, and then the entirety of it is 45 meters.
And what year did it move?
In the time of Augustus, I believe.
Okay.
Is when they moved it. So again,
and they moved it on boats.
On a boat. They had these special ships.
Okay.
So we know about one in the time of Caligula, actually, and so it was huge, probably 150 feet long, give or take, and they would ballast it with huge amounts of grain to keep it all level, and have a few hundred passengers too. But these huge, almost like the oil tankers of the ancient world, with these obelisk ships. And again, so that they could move something this size, which is about half the size of the trilithon stones. Those are moved a mile. This is moved 1,000 miles. So that they have this technology. It's simple tech, right? It's just men, lots of ropes, and rollers, probably in this case, log rollers.
Oh, there's the boat that they use.
Yeah. This is a Renaissance drawing of the obelisk ship. Actually, one of those ships is so big that they sink it in the harbor in Ostia, which is Rome's harbor, to be the base of the lighthouse, and they fill it with cement. And they found, I think, actually some traces of that ship. But yeah, so Rome is filled with obelisks. There's one in Constantinople and Istanbul also. There were a few in Alexandria that they moved later on elsewhere.
So the biggest ones then would be the Baalbek Stones, where you've got 1,000 tons or so.
Right.
And then then you've got 3 examples of stones where they were around 400 tons or something.
Yeah,
like that?
I think the Lateran obelisk at 450 is the biggest. The others are, I think, all between probably 300 and 100. They're smaller. One of them would have been even bigger. That's one in Istanbul there. That one broke, actually. The lower third of it broke off.
Okay.
And then almost the same size as the Lateran obelisk.
Okay. Yeah, just as I was sitting in next door before coming into this, I sent Ryan a couple of bullet points on why alternative history people think that Baalbek was earlier. So I wouldn't mind reading through that, and just because I'm curious to learn, like your thoughts on this and what might be being missed by the alternative history crowd. So the heavy weathering and erosion there being number one, that jumps out to me immediately, that the huge stones are way more weathered than the...
Yeah, and again, I don't know the site, and I have to kind of channel what Roman historians say. But, I've read the reports on this site, and none of them said this is all that different. So from what I know about limestone, again, it does all the same stone, same local stone, sure, but there is variation, and it might be quarried differently. There are ways to explain that besides it being older.
We can fit it in, for sure,
right.
but is it logical is the question.
To me, this is not decisive, I would say. The fact that it looks different superficially doesn't necessarily mean that it is older. It might be, but it's not decisive to me. There are huge ones that weren't used. And now this could say that it was too big to move, right? That the Romans couldn't move 1,500 tons. They could move 1,000 tons. They could move 1,500.
Could they move 1,000, I guess, is the question, yeah.
I mean, if the Egyptians could, as we know, and, the Ramesseum statue is well over 1,000. There's the ones in Tanis, I think, that are even bigger. Well before this, more than 1,000 years before this. The Romans, of course, Egypt's part of their empire. They're using these guys to shape their obelisks and to move things around. We actually have accounts of how they raised obelisks. We have a diagram actually on the obelisk of Theodosius in Istanbul. So we know how that technology worked. And sure, 450 tons is not 1,000 tons, but it's not all that different. I mean, it's half, sure. But if you can move 450 tons across the Mediterranean world, I think you can move 1,000 to 1 mile.
Could be, yeah, maybe.
So again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily true. I said we have some humility about history. There are things we just don't know and we'll never know.
Yeah.
But to me, it seems at least as likely that it is a Roman structure, totally Roman structure, as it's something older or different. So if it is different, then what is it? Some lost civilization? Okay, it could be, but where's the other evidence for that civilization? And you can find that, sure. You'd say you found that. But again, to me, looking at it from what we do know, this seems like the most straightforward explanation.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. Their burial under the sediment points to pre-Roman abandonment millennia earlier. So he's saying that they were buried and that they show marks of being buried for thousands of years, and so that's interesting.
Well, I will say that the lack of documentation means nothing because we've lost so much documentation on everything. For no Roman building we have documentation. For the Colosseum we have nothing. It'd be weird if we had anything for it.
So they're saying no inscriptions, no records about the quarry or moving anything, but you're saying that's not unusual?
No, I think that in some ways, like the stones would have been enough of an advertisement in themselves in some ways. You wouldn't need more than that. Like, look what we did. There it is. We have inscriptions on the temple itself, and on the other things. To me, it seems that if it was indeed older, then they would have commented on it. Then that would have been like, hey, we found these giant blocks. That's pretty weird, guys. Because they had myths about giants moving stones. I mentioned the Mycenaeans before. So when Greek civilization starts emerging in the 8th century BC, it emerges from the ruins of these Bronze Age forts, which have gigantic rocks, 20, 30 ton boulders. They call them Cyclopean, that the Cyclops, would move them and would build them. And around these huge stones, there are myths that grew up. Again, the Cyclopses, that there was the Bronze Age kings. But there are no stories about these stones because I think they weren't carved until the Roman era. I think if there had been these giant blocks that were just sitting out there, that's a mystery. They would have talked about that, but they don't. So in a way, silence is, I think, a better argument for it being Roman than the opposite.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, we probably beat this one to death.
Yes. So again, I'm not saying that we know because we don't. We can't know.
Yeah.
But to me, it seems again as likely that it's Roman as anything else.
And how heavy were the Roman cranes? Like, what were they able to lift?
So they didn't move really huge stones with the cranes. And Trajan's column, which is in Rome, it's this made I think of 11 or 12 huge chunks of marble. They raised the top block, which I think weighs nearly 100 tons, 100 feet in the air with cranes. That's a pretty impressive feat. That's extreme. It's unusual, but they could do it. They would have so there's some examples of Romans. They actually built one of these things in Germany. You can see it lift stones and stuff. And they'd have many cranes working together. They would there it is. They would rate them.
But that's not 100 feet. That's
no. This would be a smaller thing.
Yeah.
Like for the Trajan's column, it would have been probably
25.
like 4 or 5 of those things working together. There's a famous one with an aqueduct being built. Again, so they can multiply cranes to lift things. For obelisks, they would use like capstans, men pulling wires, and they'd be drawn up together. But it seems like for the really heavy stones, if you're moving them around, it was like the Egyptians. It'd be log rollers or a lubricated surface of some sort, because a crane can't necessarily lift that much rock.
No.
And so if Baalbek was moved the way I assume it was moved, it would have been a big earthen ramp, a causeway built from the quarry all the way to the foundation, and just hauled over that causeway, I would think.
Okay. And then in terms of the aqueducts, and maybe we talk a little bit about the like the cement that they used, because that was super incredible engineering, right? Volcanic essentially, and still holds up better than most cement today. What's the story with that construction?
Yeah, the Romans got geologically lucky, basically.
Okay.
That they grew up in a volcanic landscape, their city. So everything around them is either igneous stone or these pockets of ash. And this ash, what they called pozzolana, it's this kind of very fine volcanic sediment. They found that they mixed this with lime and with water and made a kind of mortar that was incredibly strong. Most mortar, lime mortar, is weaker than the rocks it binds together. But this mortar was as strong as the rocks, or it seemed to be. And more importantly, it could even cure underwater. It was actually strengthened by seawater, which we'll get into in a moment. So the Romans began using this cement, as we call it, for everything, from building walls. It was like the filler in the walls, to building vaults and domes. So the Dome of the Pantheon is the most famous triumph of Roman concrete. It's still the world's biggest unsupported concrete dome anywhere. And it's 142 Roman feet wide, with that oculus in the center. And it's self-supporting because the concrete's just that strong. I mentioned before how seawater actually strengthens it. So here it is. There's a sample of Roman cement, and there's the oculus and the rotunda of the Pantheon.
Yeah, I've been in there. It's incredible.
Isn't it awesome?
Yep.
Yeah, I was never as impressed by anything as I was when I was 14 years old and saw that building the first time. But and they're from above. So when the seawater, it catalyzes this chemical reaction in the cement, which makes it incredibly strong, stronger than any modern cement, or almost any modern cement. And it's self-healing to a degree. So you strike it, and it'll fix those bonds. And so there are Roman piers, Roman quays, Roman breakwaters that are still intact after 2,000 years because the combination of this cement with seawater has created this incredibly durable material.
Okay.
It's wonderful stuff, and it could be poured. It was poured over molds to make this dome. Yeah, there's a breakwater there. And
they used it for everything, right?
Yeah, so it was used mostly around Rome itself. That's where the volcanic ash was, there and around Naples. But when they built things elsewhere, like the King Herod of the Bible, for example, he built a big harbor at Caesarea, what's now Israel. He shipped Roman sand, this volcanic sand, all the way across the Mediterranean to have proper Roman cement for his new harbor. It really is a remarkable material, and it's. They can create kind of an equivalent where there isn't that volcanic sand by mixing in terracotta, like smashed pottery, into with the lime and the sand, which does make an almost equally strong mortar. So like Hagia Sophia, the great church in Istanbul, that dome is made with terracotta-infused Roman cement. But it allows them to create interior spaces that were unprecedented. The Greek temples are meant to look cool from the outside. Not from the inside. They're pretty cramped and dark inside because that's the god's house. It's the god's treasury as well. But the Romans, with their baths, with temples like the Pantheon, create the first great interior spaces in Western architecture. kind of the first cathedral-like spaces in a lot of ways. And concrete allows them to have these vast, unobstructed interiors, these rotundas, these vaults that often still stand today.
Okay. Yeah. And so the Colosseum then, can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
I want to kind of get into that and the construction and what was going on there. Half of it's kind of missing, and there's
Yes.
a pretty cool story about that, I know, from your incredible YouTube channel that you have. You got a great video. I think that's one of your more popular videos, actually.
It's the most popular, yeah.
Yeah. But let's walk us through some
Sure.
of the, just educate us about this structure.
Yeah. So the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, is the biggest and best Roman arena. It's designed for one thing, and that's for the gladiators, for the gladiatorial games. People can watch these famous contests play out. There are also beast hunts where they hunt exotic animals from as far away as the Serengeti in the arena, but it's really designed for the gladiatorial spectacles. It's built over the course of about a decade in the 70s AD.
Wow.
Pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah, that's pretty quick.
By Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian. And it's basically meant to be an oversized version of what they've already been building, these very large amphitheaters. And so it's quite tall. It's about 170 feet high around that circuit wall. But it's now almost hollow. It's been cored out by stone robbing over the course of the Middle Ages. So you look inside, you just see this kind of hollow skeleton. Imagine all that being cloaked in marble and having seats all around, about 45,000 seats, give or take. And below the arena, it's very elaborate. They call it the hypogeum, this underworld of cages and corridors in which they kept the animals and the stage machinery that would pop up through trapdoors. There have been 80 trapdoors in the arena. It's like in the movie Gladiator, where the tigers pop out and stuff. It's the same idea. Where beasts can appear suddenly, and even like whole artificial mountains can be made to materialize through that arena. So built around 70 to 80 AD, as I mentioned, and used for about 400 years, give or take. It's repaired many times. There's a giant fire in the 3rd century that destroyed, lightning hit the upper decks, which were all wooden, caused it to be had to be restored for about a decade. But the seating is by social order. So if you're important, you're close to the action, close to the arena. And that's because they have this massive fence there that keeps the animals from leaping up and destroying you. It's also, so if you're a senator, you sit in the podium, which is the first 3 levels, these kind of broad tiers. And you bring your own cushioned seat, which is good. The rest of it's all just hard marble and pretty uncomfortable for over a long day. The equestrians, Rome's other aristocratic order, sit just above that. And then all of the commoners, the free commoners, organized by like trade organizations. There we go, yeah. So like the Maenianum is the main section. Mm-hmm. And the very highest bit, the Maenianum secundum in lignes, that means just the wooden highest part. In lignes is in the beams. And that's where the slaves and women sat. So yeah, if you were a woman or if you were not free, you were in the nosebleeds.
It's a quick way to lose your wife, hanging out with all the slaves.
Well, it's just how it was done. If you're a senator, you can keep her with you. Everywhere else, like, sorry, honey, you're going up in the... have fun with the slaves.
Yeah.
But it was probably thought to be inappropriate for women for the most part. It was almost all a male audience, we assume.
Okay.
But yeah, it wouldn't be graceful, you would think. All right, see you, honey.
Yeah,
enjoy the chickpeas up there.
Right. Enjoy the drinks.
Yeah.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, and there were, we think, vendors, by the way, who would sell things like chickpeas and other snacks.
Yep.
There were bathrooms built into the corridors, which is pretty cool. It was a very elaborate plumbing system. There were water fountains, actually, that would like spurt water continuously in the frame. Really a very elaborate system. And it's thought that there were 80 entrances. 76 of them were public. And they were so well designed that you could fill or empty this whole building in about 15 minutes.
Wow.
Which is better than most modern stadiums, actually.
Yeah.
So, and getting in, there weren't tickets. There were things called tesserae, these tokens or clay fragments, which you would present at the entrance. It was free to get in. There was never any admission charge. It was the emperor's gift each of the games.
That's crazy.
And
That's
then
cool.
we have accounts of the games here. Oh yeah, this is, I think, him giving out tesserae or something. Yeah, Libertalitas.
So how did you get? How did you get to be one of the people that was able to get one of those tablets to get into the thing?
By knowing somebody, basically, like anything. So if you were prominent, if you were a senator, you had an automatic invitation, or an equestrian.
Okay.
Otherwise, we think they were given out en masse, like guilds, basically, these organizations of tradesmen, and they would have a certain number of seats available for their members. It's like, okay, if you're a member of the Fullers Guild or something, we have 30 tickets, you might get one of those seats. I don't know how you get them. You probably have to buy them. There's probably a secondhand market that's pretty fierce. because there aren't that many games in Rome. There are lots of chariot races every day, or almost every day, in the Circus Maximus. That's the real mass spectator sport in the ancient world. But there's probably only, we assume, maybe a dozen games a year in the Colosseum.
Huh.
And so they're probably highly demanded, those tickets. People want to be in on that action.
Yeah, that would be a huge, to have one of those tablets to be able to get in. That's a huge deal. Did they ever have any streakers?
I was asked this once on Reddit. It's a great question. I love it. And the answer is they would have died so fast if they tried it. Because, so here's the problem. So first of all, maybe you came up from below, like one of those trap doors, you might have a chance briefly. Yeah. But there were Praetorian guards, archers, stationed all around that arena. You'd be pincushioned before you got 15 feet, almost certainly. Right. You were coming from the stands. So there's this enormous fence I mentioned before, which has within its iron fence with ivory rollers, so the animals couldn't climb up them, with elephant tusks and golden nets on top. So you have to scale that somehow from the one side, and then their guards again are stationed at intervals all along this barrier. So if you weren't impaled on one of the elephant tusks, you'd be shot down when you try to get onto the arena in the first place. It takes quite some doing, in other words.
Yeah, solid security, better security than we have today, better entrance and exit, better design, better incredible
it was quite
games.
An arena.
And this was did this come from some other earlier designs, or was this just built from scratch?
There were earlier amphitheaters. Beginning in about, we think, the early 1st century BC, the Romans built these things. In Pompeii, for example, there's an amphitheater from about 80 BC, which is much more primitive than the Colosseum. It's just kind of a big earthen ring with seats built in. There's none of these elaborate corridors and water fountains and stuff. But it's Roman innovation. Theaters, here's the Pompeii amphitheater. Theaters were Greek. They recently had very elaborate theaters, but they were built into a hill almost always. They're just one side. There's none of the audience amenities that the Romans have. The Romans just mass spectacle is a Roman specialty in a lot of ways, and the Romans just get very good at building for it. A lot of infrastructure. Right. And of course, when the emperor's commissioning things, then you get the best.
Just to ask real quick, going back to the Colosseum, how often would games or events be held there?
It would vary from year to year, but we assume probably no more than a dozen times in an average year. Occasionally, the emperors would celebrate some massive triumph. So Trajan had 123 days of games to celebrate his conquest of Dacia, modern Romania. And so there, probably they were at intervals, but almost the whole year would be games. Not every day would be gladiators. You'd have beast hunts one day. You'd have, animals doing tricks another day. But it'd be pretty infrequent in most years.
Let's take a quick break.
Sure.
Get a bite to eat, get a restroom break. I know Ryan is always dying for a restroom after about 45 minutes, so we're way past that. So we'll take a quick break. There's other stuff I want to talk to you about for sure, from the economy to other stuff we'll get into prior to closing it out. So awesome start so far. Super enjoyed it, and thank you for the education.
Thanks, me too, of course.
Yeah, awesome. Good. Okay. Well, welcome back. So,
yes, thank you.
Yeah, we talked a little bit at lunch about Egypt and kind of the. Kind of segueing into that, and I mentioned Hawara, and you had thoughts and comments on Hawara. It's currently a hot topic within kind of just in general, but certainly within the ancient civilization community, of trying to understand, kind of the history of what it is and what's really going on down there. So there are accounts of Hawara being visited by the Greeks and Romans, right?
Yes. So Herodotus, the father of history, the Greek author who was the first one to create a narrative history, wrote a whole book about just Egypt, which he visited as a tourist. And he was especially impressed by the labyrinth, the great labyrinth of Hawara, which is a funerary temple, a mortuary temple that was incredibly large and complex and had 2 layers of rooms. Each layer had hundreds of rooms and snaking passageways, kind of dark corners that in their half-ruined state seem almost unlimited to the Greeks and Romans. And it was a major destination for tourists like Herodotus to come check out and kind of speculate wildly about. They didn't have a good grasp of chronology, honestly. But yes, the fact that they're finding new things there is wonderful. It was heavily pillaged, of course, in the Roman and later periods. And so on the surface, it looks pretty unimpressive now. It's just scatters of stone chips. but that they're finding more below the ground, I think, is a matter of time.
Right.
And should be very impressive. I hope so.
For sure, for sure. So what was he really saying that before it got kind of pillaged in later times? Like, what were the Greeks, Herodotus specifically, or any of the other Greeks really saying about what they saw within the structure?
I'm trying to remember. There's this kind of I mentioned before the rhetoric of size. There's the rhetoric of numbers too, just kind of big round numbers. Like there are 300 rooms and 300 courts, and and on 2 levels. It seems like it was, from what we know about archaeology too, just an immensely large funerary temple with kind of duplicated parts, so symmetrical, and it was probably in pretty bad shape by the time they were seeing it. It had been pillaged already for its stone by the time Herodotus showed up. And so he probably was trying to extrapolate from this half-ruined, sprawling structure some kind of order, trying to assume that, okay, there was a court here, a room there, this mirrored that. But it's kind of confused. We have him, and I think Strabo, who was writing a few centuries later, also mentions the labyrinth. But after that, it was so badly pillaged that on the surface it was unimpressive, and so we know little about its later history.
Okay, yeah, there was apparently like a ditch or a canal or something that in the 20th century was redirected and due to construction, and that it sort of potentially flooded the underground. That you said it was 2 levels. The one would have been above ground and one underground, and that the underground was flooded by this canal that was reworked. So now the talk is like, how do we undo, like change the direction of the canal, get it out of there, and then excavate?
Yeah, well, I'm sure you know that groundwater is a problem throughout Egypt, because of the river being high now perpetually, or higher perpetually, and having built its bed up over the centuries. Yep. And around, that's in the Fayum, right? And so around the Fayum, especially with that lake there, it's a higher water table. For people who study papyri, that's kind of a hotbed, or used to be for papyri, but with the water level creeping up, whatever's still in the ground is being destroyed. So it's a problem for everyone, archaeologists of all eras, the onslaught of the water.
What was it like for tourism with people visiting sites like this? So in the Greek time or in Roman times, like who was it that was doing was it the most wealthy people? Was it like commoners? Was it everybody once a year? Was it how did kind of tourism and travel work in the ancient world?
Yeah. There definitely was tourism in the Greek era. Herodotus is really a tourist, a very cultural tourist. But it's the Romans who pioneer what we would think of as some approximation of mass tourism. It is almost entirely the wealthy who have the leisure, just have the time to go away from their jobs and gallivant around. Because it takes a long time to get anywhere in the ancient world. In the case of Egypt, it'd be a couple weeks from Rome to Alexandria in the best conditions during summer, much longer if the weather was less cooperative, you're going against the winds. And it would be a couple months in Egypt, a very leisurely tour, as travel really was before the railroads in the 19th century, like the Grand Tour in the early modern period. So they would go to Alexandria, which is the Roman world's second largest city, probably almost 500,000 people, a gargantuan metropolis. See the famous lighthouse, see the Tomb of Alexander, which is there, the crystal coffin that had the conqueror. And then they would go down the Nile. There was no Cairo yet, but there where Cairo now stands, where the delta branches off, just above that, was Memphis, the second city of Egypt, or the third city. And there they would see the Apis bull. They would feed it sometimes, hang out with it, see the mummified bulls, go to the pyramids. It was a popular tourist activity to pay locals to scamper up the Great Pyramid, which had smooth casing stones then, so it was hard to do. But local boys knew where the cracks were, so they would kind of, find their way up. And how this became a thing, I don't know. But to do that, there actually are graffiti on the Great Pyramid. There were.
I'm sure nobody ever got hurt died trying to climb up.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. It's super dangerous today.
Sure. Yeah, even with the ledges of the backing stones.
Right. It's usually the way down that gets people as opposed to the way up. But
yeah, I'm sure all kinds of terrible things happened. But, the Romans, like ugly tourists throughout history. You're like, oh, yeah, this is a fun thing.
Yeah.
And then from Memphis and the pyramids, they go down the Nile, kind of cruising like modern tourists in many ways. Go to Hawara, see the labyrinth, what was left of it. There are a number of flourishing Roman towns all around the Fayum, so we might visit a few of those. Go on down the Nile to Luxor, where the great destination was, or the 2 destinations were, the Valley of the Kings, where about a dozen tombs, more or less, were open. And we have from those tombs about 2,000 graffiti, Latin and Greek, and some Coptic, of visitors who came and said, hey, I saw the tombs and they were great, or I wasn't impressed, or all I care about was the sarcophagus, things like that. And the Colossus of Memnon, this gargantuan monolithic statue, about 700 tons, that had stood outside the funerary temple of Amenhotep III, but had been cracked by an earthquake. And so dew escaping from the cracks made by the earthquake would sing every morning. It would kind of make this almost like a harp-like noise. And this became a destination. Hearing the statue sing was a thing to do if you're in the south of Egypt.
Okay.
A few would go all the way down to the first cataract, where the dam now is, and ride the rapids in these small canoes. So kind of ancient whitewater rafting, which is kind of fun.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, I mean, and then what about the economy of the Romans? Because we hear a lot. I think Ryan was pretty shocked to hear that they had inflation in Roman times, and kind of like, I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing today can kind of mirror what we've seen in the past in a lot of ways, and maybe the economic situation there might be one of them. Talk to me about the economy of ancient Rome and like the coins and ultimately what happened to cause, the inflation and the downfall.
For about 3 centuries, the Roman economy is actually a very impressive success story. So they conquer the whole Mediterranean basin, the first culture to ever do that, then or since, and creating, in effect, a very large free trade zone. And there are still customs barriers. There are, cities levy customs duties at harbors and stuff, but it does make trade a lot easier over a vast area. At the same time, the Roman economy creates economies of scale. There are bigger estates. Animals are bred to be larger. There's trade between all the major centers. Olive oil is shipped from Spain to Rome, for example, in massive quantities, so massive that the heap of discarded oil amphorae is the size of the Colosseum today. It's still there. You can visit it, Monte Testaccio. This huge heap of just shattered Spanish olive oil amphorae that were discarded after being poured out in Rome. Wine is grown from Britain all the way down into Egypt and is traded very freely. There are pottery kilns that can fire 50,000 vessels at a single time. So there really is, in many ways, because of these economies of scale, there are new efficiencies. And the economy actually grows in the Roman world substantially, slowly, but substantially, which is almost unique in antiquity. Usually in the ancient world, because there's not much technological advancement, the economy only grows as the population grows, as there are more producers and consumers.
Sure.
But here it actually outpaces population growth, we think. Not by too much, but by a bit, which is very cool.
And that's due to innovation and productivity?
Yes, more or less. And there are some innovations, like there are new kinds of threshers in Gaul, for example, these mass pottery kilns I mentioned before. There are these huge grain mills that can mill grain in unprecedented quantities. And so there is definitely a sense in which the economy of the Roman Empire works very well until it doesn't. Because in terms of coinage especially, the Romans have a uniform coinage across the empire for gold and silver. Bronzes are minted locally, so they can vary a little bit, but the chief coinage is the gold aureus and the silver denarius. While the Romans are on the upswing, while they're conquering new people, while they're opening new mines in places like Spain and Dacia, modern Romania, the metal supply is abundant, and they can mint coins freely and in huge numbers. We still have, I would guess, about 10 million Roman coins today, mostly bronze, but they still exist. They're minted in that vast quantity. But what happens in the 3rd century...
And that's spread out throughout the general population, basically, now at
It
this
is.
point.
So the main way that they get money into the economy is they pay their soldiers.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, the 10 million that exist today are owned by just anyone can buy and sell.
Yeah. I mean, it's like these here. These are late Roman bronzes. You can buy one of those coins for $20. They're spread around. And they'll still find them every year by the tens of thousands in places from Britain to Bulgaria.
And shipwrecks probably too and stuff.
Yeah, there too. I mean, you'd be amazed how many coins they find. And there's some hoards discovered in the Balkans that had 100,000 coins.
Wow.
Just massive.
Yeah.
But anyways, so there are, as I was saying, the Romans got money into the economy via the military primarily, because the troops are pretty well paid, about as well as a skilled craftsman. So you pay the troops in gold and silver, and then they spread it out through the economy from the border forts and from Rome itself. People also pay their taxes, usually in coins. Not always. They pay in grain sometimes or in kind other ways. But more often than not, currency is the medium of exchange for taxes. So the government's ideal is they pump money into the economy via the troops and get it back via taxes. But starting in the 3rd century, they have less and less precious metal flowing in because their mines are becoming depleted. They're conquering no more people, and wars are more frequent and more expensive. There's also the fact that the imperial system is becoming more and more unstable. They're from about 235 to 280 AD. There are more than 30 emperors. This is called the military anarchy. And each of those emperors has to buy the loyalty of his troops. So you keep raising the pay again and again and again. So in an era when everyone assumes that the value of money is tied to the amount of precious metal inside it, the amount of gold and silver it contains, and at a time, too, when you need to pay more gold and silver than ever before to these ever-multiplying and ever more needy troops, it's a disaster. Because the only way to create more gold and silver, or more gold and silver coins, is to debase them, to add bronze to the denarius above all. And so the Romans debased their currency, slowly at first, but then more and more rapidly. And the denarius, the silver coin, which had been the core of the Roman economy, which had begun at almost, I think it was 98% silver, falls gradually to 2% silver. And people realize this. They know it's not the good metal, and so they demand more coins for the goods they're buying. And that means inflation happens. Inflation happens at a staggering pace for a while. It destroys the currency. There are reforms in the late 3rd century. The Romans do manage to recover a working currency, but they never get silver back because every time they create silver, the emperors are tempted to debase it so quickly that consumers don't trust it anymore.
Wow.
As the economy has to limp on with just the gold coins used for very expensive purchases and the bronze used for everyday stuff.
So, I mean, kind of like what's happening with debasement of currency today.
Yeah, there definitely can seem like there are a lot of parallels. You know, we of course don't regard gold and silver as being intrinsically valuable the way we used to. Of course, gold and silver are still very valuable as commodities. But people don't trust money in some ways the way they used to, the U.S. money. And it's a matter of trust, really, what happens in times of crisis. And I think that what we're seeing globally and even domestically is a failure of trust in the U.S. government and what it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but with a $38 trillion debt, the only way to pay that off is to debase the currency and to make the value of that debt lower by creating more dollars. And at the same time, you're debasing the savings accounts of every American that's retired or working. You're debasing the currency. So the 38 trillion becomes a smaller. It's going to go to 40, it's going to go to 50, it's going to go to 75, but the true value of that is going to keep decreasing as long as you're debasing the currency. And that's what our system has realized, and that's the strategy anytime we get into debt is to create inflation. But it sounds like the inflation was not created for the same reason, but it was inflation nonetheless. And why was it that it was being fed into the troops first? I mean, I think I kind of get it. Like you have to keep them happy, and they're really the drivers of the economy. And so when you say they spread it, you mean they spend it basically, right? And that trickles down into the economy, and then that's how the general population gets their money. But to have the troops be the people that are paid first, you're essentially buying your military. You're paying. You're keeping the system intact by making sure that the people with the shields and the swords are the ones who are getting their money first.
Yes, and there's two reasons. First being that ultimately the emperor's power relies on the legions. You know, that's the buck stops there, basically. You know, he can claim to be a Republican magistrate that rules with the will of the people, but ultimately it's those swords and shields that keep him in the throne. The other reason is that throughout the imperial era, about 3/4 of the budget is the soldiers. They are far and away the biggest expense the emperors have. And so that's where the money's always been going. Everything from the Colosseum to the villas we see in Pompeii, all of that, that's the froth. That's the minor spending compared to the huge amount being pumped throughout the imperial era into the army.
So how much of this stuff that we know about ancient Rome comes to us from Pompeii?
A huge amount. Pompeii is our best window into daily life in the ancient world. So Pompeii and its sister city Herculaneum, famously, are buried by Vesuvius by an eruption in AD 79. And they're buried deep enough that the Romans can't scavenge too much from the ruins. And so it's a time capsule They had some warning, in Pompeii especially, that something was coming. So they took some of the valuables out. They scavenged some stuff later on a little bit too. But besides that, we have their houses as they left them. We have like a house where there's still painters left their pots on the floor. They were frescoing the walls as they left. We find restaurants where everyone fled just before the ash came falling down. Gardens which were left intact when they were buried. And so it's a way of looking at how a Roman city, a pretty unimportant Roman city, but still a thriving one, functioned. And for most people, and for me included, it's the houses that are the real highlight there. Most big Roman mansions were kind of multi-use complexes where you would have a row of shops out front, often taverns, we would call them, tabernae, where they would serve hot foods, chickpeas, maybe sandwiches, bits of pork or chicken, or even like a pottery shop, whatever else. They're led into the front of these big mansions, and then there might be rental units kind of scattered around. But there's a main door which goes into a large courtyard, or that's kind of the heart of the house, and the atrium right in front of it. The atrium is where the master of the house meets with his guests. That's sort of the reception room. And then beyond is this often very carefully cultivated garden, which might have a fountain, might have pools and streams of water, might have large nut and fruit trees, sort of a haven away from the city in the heart of these mansions. And all around will be the main dining spaces, which are frescoed with the myths. And so all those famous paintings from Pompeii come from rooms like this. They're cut down from the walls and brought to the Naples Museum. And so we find in these houses, aside from the decorations and the roots of those trees and everything else, everything from the safes that they use to keep their money protected, the kitchenware, all of their bronze cooking pots, the games they played in some cases, and even their own bodies. We found they had enough warning to get away in most cases. Ash fell for about 12 hours before the big pyroclastic flow came that buried the whole city. But hundreds stayed, and they were buried with their houses. And so we find them as they laid. And they, when they find a body, it leaves a cavity in the ash, the hardened ash, which they filled with plaster. And so you see the impression left by the faces. It's very moving sometimes, haunting. And so going to Pompeii is a way of glimpsing how these cities worked. I've been there during a heavy rainstorm. And they had one of these bodies, someone who was, like he was gasping for air when the eruption overtook him.
Yep.
I was there in a heavy rainstorm once, and you can still see that the gutters and sewers still work.
Really?
You see the water rolling down the sides of the street and go down into the cisterns.
I've been there, but it's been probably 25 years. I don't remember much of it, but
yeah. No, it's a cool place.
Yeah. So I mean, the gutters and the streets and how were those composed? Like how were they created?
They would use the local basalt, the hard volcanic rock. And they would actually cut ruts into them, that their carts had a standard wheelbase. And so they would cut these ruts, and they'd actually fill them with molten iron. So they'd be almost like a primitive railroad in some cases. And so these iron-filled ruts become, like I said, railroad-like in some cases, and they direct traffic. Most streets are one way, and we can tell, from the way that the turnings are cut into the pavement. And so it had a pretty elaborate traffic pattern, we can tell, where cars come in one way, they can be parked in certain alleys next to certain garages, basically, rolling around these streets. And then there are raised stepping stones between the curbs, which allow pedestrians to go from one side to the other without going into the muck that was undoubtedly collecting, all along those ruts. It wasn't the cleanest place in the world, but it was well drained because all of those basalt streets had sewers beneath them, which channeled down to the sea. And so whenever it rains, they still work now.
Wow. Yeah, it's incredible. And then there were chariots found too there as well, right?
They found some traces. Actually, our best chariot from the ancient world is an Etruscan burial. They found a full war chariot from an Etruscan aristocrat, disassembled in a tomb near Rome. That was from well before the main Roman era. We don't have a fully preserved cart, I think. We can know a lot about them from even just the ruts, which tell us how big they were, how much wear they put on the roads, which is really, really remarkable.
That's cool. Talk to me about the dodecahedrons.
These bronze things that are discovered all over the Roman world.
Yeah.
We don't know. I mean, I think that the prevailing theory is that they were used for some kind of a dice oracle, they called them. So there are all kinds of ways to try and learn the future in the ancient world. The most famous are the actual physical oracles, like the oracle at Delphi, or the Sibyl of Cumae, where you talk to a woman who's seated in some dark cave, and she gives you a cryptic response that's the voice of the god. But there are also ways you can kind of do it yourself. You can observe birds. You can look at the stars. They're big into astrology. The stars do govern everything they do. Or you can try to use games of chance to determine what will happen in the future. And there are things called dice oracles, where they throw 3 or 4 dice, for example, and the pattern of the dice will tell them what happens next, or what kind of choice they should make. And one theory I've read for these dodecahedrons is that it's some form of this dice oracle. But they're not inscribed, so it's not hard to say how that would have worked. They're for some kind of game, I think, if not. If it's not an oracle, it must be for some game of chance, but we can't be sure.
Are they all different? Are the holes all different shapes and sizes, or are they consistent?
I think they vary. I think all that's the same is their basic shape, the 12 faces.
Okay.
And the material varies, the size varies. But yeah, it really is a mystery. And my guess, and it is just a guess, is that it was divination in some way, some kind of oracle. But how that would have worked, I have no idea. Again, those vast gaps in our knowledge are left by people not writing down things that are everyday.
Right.
Maybe you can see how different these are. How maybe it was a game. Maybe it was a way of trying to know the future. But either way, it wasn't worthy of recording. And so we'll never probably know. Unless we find one that's in a context that helps us say, oh, it was this or that.
Yeah, it's too bad Pompeii couldn't have helped us with this mystery, right? Were they later than that, or were they?
I think they're found throughout the imperial era,
Yeah.
in the first few centuries AD. A lot of them come from Britain, but it's probably just better excavation, to be honest, than anything else. They're all over the Roman world, as far as I know, at least the European portion.
It'd be interesting if they aligned with, if they created shadows, or if the sun went through them on solstice or equinox in a certain way, and that they could tell you what time of year you were in, or
Using the holes. Yeah, I don't know. They had pretty sophisticated sundials.
Yeah.
Actually, a fun one. Yeah. So Augustus, one of the obelisks he brought to Rome, he made it the pointer, the gnomon of a giant sundial. And so that would tell you, the season, all kinds of like that. They actually have it still. They found part of the pavement, which is pretty cool. And the obelisk itself is not long gone.
I've heard sewing potentially as a theory for
Oh,
them.
yes, through the holes.
Yeah,
Like a weight.
Yeah.
We really just don't know.
Who knows?
I'm sure there are better theories than the ones that I've spouted here, but
I don't know.
That's sort of my gut feeling is either a game or possibly, oh, here we go. So here's a whole bunch of things.
The game makes a lot of sense, I think, too. Yeah.
Yeah, and the magical objects. So yeah, that's interesting how they found something kind of comparable in that. I've read about this. It's like they call it the magician's chest in Pompeii.
Oh, okay.
Really counterfeit coins. That's an interesting one.
That is. I wonder how that would even work.
Maybe like the noise the coin made, you tap it against it. I'm guessing. Oh yeah, that's what you were mentioning. Yeah.
Or maybe it could tell you in round terms how much silver it had versus other material. If you tap,
Yeah, they do sound different.
Yeah.
I mentioned before I collect Roman coins, and I have a few from the 3rd century when they were debasing the currency so aggressively. It does sound different when it's mostly bronze than when it's pure silver, but less of a ring to it.
Yep.
So here's the fortune-telling thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was my guess. But
Yeah.
It's the very last one here, so I know what that means.
It's just incredible that there's 12 different possibilities, and we don't know which one is. It's
No. Yeah.
And who knows if it's even one of these.
It might not be, or it might be several of these things, right?
Yeah, could be.
That we're making these things and putting it in a single category when they've been different uses.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so often the case.
What are any other big mysteries or things that we just don't know the answer to yet? Kind of like that.
Yeah, I mean those are the most famous ones. Kind of a fun one. You may have heard of the ships of Caligula. So Caligula, the famously megalomaniacal Roman emperor who reigns in the 1st century AD, built a pair of these huge ships on Lake Nemi near Rome. And they were floating palaces. They were pleasure barges that were a couple 100 feet long. They had baths, hot water, really just everything but the kitchen sink floating in Lake Nemi. And 2 of them, so you see they're gigantic. 2 of them were recovered from the lake bottom by Mussolini. He hauled them up from the lake at vast expense, what was left of them. They were preserved by being stuck in the mud and displayed in a museum. And they were done. And here's one that was coming out of the ground.
Wow.
And then it was destroyed only 10 years later during World War II. There was a firefight between the Germans and the Americans. The museum caught on fire, and that was the end of the 2 ships.
Wow.
I have seen some theories that there's a third ship down there, the deepest part of the lake. I don't know if that's true. It probably isn't, but that'd be a fun thing.
That would be pretty cool.
Because the museum now is really sad, honestly, because you go to see the holes which these two ships rested, just this vast emptiness, and a few little fragments of timbers that they recovered after the museum burned.
And then what about, I guess to close off, like the downfall of the Roman Empire? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that is the greatest mystery of all. That this system that had such immense staying power for half a millennium, that held together the whole Mediterranean world, suddenly came unstitched. And we always think the barbarians coming over the borders and swamping the Romans. That's part of the answer. But it's really a combination, we think, of civil war, chronic civil war, weakening the system very badly, these barbarian invasions coming over. And that's not the first time that they've been invaded by barbarians, but they'd lost that old assimilating power they'd had before of making these guys part of the Roman world. They were too divided, too weak, too poor to keep these guys part of the system in the way before. So they fobbed them off. They gave them land within the empire. The economy was collapsing for various reasons. And the local elites who had always supported the empire, these local bigwigs, were for various reasons no longer so attached to the emperor. They make deals with the barbarians as they came over the border. They didn't want to defend Rome. They just wanted to save themselves. And so,
what year are we talking now?
This is in the West, the 5th century, the 400s AD. And it was a slow thing. It was a few generations. But basically, the system stopped being able to sustain itself. And why that happened exactly is still kind of a mystery. What balance of things it was. We know the factors that contributed. The invasions, the civil wars, the economic collapse. But what balance there was and how much just pure serendipity had to do with it. A few more battles won, the empire might still be around today, honestly. It was a close thing. And it was around for 1,000 years more in the East, the Byzantine Empire. It's just the Roman Empire living on into the Middle Ages. But it's endlessly fascinating because people like to see parallels, of course, between what happened to Rome and other powers, above all now America. I always say as a historian that we shouldn't compare any cultures that are so unlike as the Romans and us. That we live in this, post-capitalist society and a global economy, one that prizes innovation, one that's very innovative in all kinds of ways. The Romans are the opposite. They're very traditional. They revile innovation. They have a much smaller world. It's a conquest empire with much simpler bases. But it is true, I think, that great powers tend to change more slowly than the world around them. They get complacent. And that happened to the Romans in various ways, and I think you can say it happened to us, too. And it has been happening to us. So in that way, there are definitely parallels. I think even more with the Roman Republic's demise, about how an elected government more or less sold itself out and collapsed from within. And so I don't want to be a doomsday prophet or anything, or claim that there are direct parallels between Rome and America, because there aren't. It's too different. But we can learn from history in the sense that there are cautionary tales throughout the past, and Rome is certainly full of them.
Yeah, well said. Well, it's been amazing. It's been an incredible conversation. I've learned a ton, and you're very obviously incredibly knowledgeable and very passionate, very articulate. You explain things in a way that I can understand and that the audience can follow and understand. So I know that's a big part of the reason why your channel is so successful, and it's a great channel. My audience needs to go over and subscribe to your channel and check it out because you're doing a lot of great things over there. You've got a lot of great content, great videos, and I think it's just been an amazing conversation, and can't thank you enough for flying down. The one thing for me, I think, is that erosion on the Baalbek stone. It's for me, it's it just seems like a different construction type, and I think as we're walking out, Ryan said, yeah, in Peru, you've got the same thing with these crazy stones that are completely fit together perfectly that nobody can understand, and then just a bunch of kind of pebbles stacked on top of it, And so for me, that's similar to Baalbek, but I recognize, that is not the predominant theory, and so I appreciate you educating us about the reasons why.
Of course.
We think.
Well, thanks so much for having me on here, honestly, man.
Yeah.
This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's As far as the Baalbek thing goes, as I was saying also during the lunch break, again, I can't pretend that we know everything about this. We ever will know everything about it. We don't. It's just sort of what I'm trained to do is say, okay, here's what we do know. I can extrapolate from that, and that's as far as I can go. So yeah, I think that you can certainly say that some things will probably remain mysteries. That's one of them, I think.
Yeah, love it.
But again, this has been a wonderful conversation. So really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else to close out with? I mean, where else can people follow you? Where else can people?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my YouTube channel is called Told in Stone. I have two smaller channels, Told in Stone Footnotes and Scenic Roots of the Past, which are both kind of subsidiary content. I've written a few books. My favorite one is called Fat Gladiators, War Elephants, and Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants. Forgot my own book title. And it's all about answering questions about the ancient world in this kind of short and hopefully kind of punchy manner. But I lead tours also, so check it all out on toldinstone.com and my websites. But appreciate it again, Matt. And
awesome.
Hope I'll be at it again sometime.
For sure. Yeah, we'd love to do it again sometime. Appreciate it, man. It's been a great conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you.